So you found the skeleton. How would you tell if it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. For years now, Kent has been running something he calls Creation Boot Camp, which is a several-week-long set of classes that is supposed to take someone from knowing more or less nothing about creation science and turn them into someone who can confidently spout off creationist talking points. I've never really looked into such videos, and normally I wouldn't bother responding to Kent in my scripted videos, as he's far too low tier and I have a whole live show, Kent with Bent, dedicated to debunking Kent Hovind. But this video isn't really about Kent. It's about the guest lecturer he brought in, Dan Biddle. For those of you who don't know, Dan Biddle is the guy behind the relatively small creationist organization Genesis Apologetics. Dan has a doctorate in communication, and I will say his videos are well produced and edited in general. They are also a weird hodgepodge of various, often mutually contradictory ideas in creationism. He has a few of his own ideas that I haven't heard anywhere else. I've already covered Biddle a few times, but I want to look at this not just for the sake of what he's saying, but also in terms of how what he says about creationism might differ from what Kent says.
Adventureland in Lenox, Alabama. This is our boot camp.
The original video starts with Kent mid-sentence, and that was not my editing.
2024. We started in 2005. Creation boot camp to get people equipped to go fight the devil and his stupid lies about evolution. We teach that evolution is the dumbest and most dangerous religion in the history of the world, and it's nothing but a religion.
Let us pray.
Our Darwin, who art in the British Museum, hallowed be thy name. Thy evolution come, thy selection be done, on land as it is in water. Give us this day our daily sexual selection as we sexually select, and lead us not into inbreeding, but deliver us from extinction. Amen.
You have to believe in evolution.
Believe just means to accept a proposition as true. It's not a dirty word, and it especially shouldn't be for a Christian. Everyone has myriad beliefs. I believe my computer exists and can be used to produce YouTube videos. Some beliefs are true, some aren't. Some are held for good reasons, and some are not. Anytime you can answer yes to the question, is X true? Then you believe X.
You have to believe you're related to a strawberry, don't you, Dave? Yeah.
Yes, evolution entails universal common ancestry. So if you believe evolution is true, which you should, since that's where all the evidence points, then it entails that you should also believe that you're related however distantly to any given organism, strawberries included.
Anyway, tonight, Dr. Dan Biddle is going to talk about the flood. The Bible says in 2 Peter chapter 3, the scoffers at the end of time would be willingly ignorant.
That sounds like a great description of Kent himself. As a simple example, he has had the concept of monophyly explained to him over and over again by multiple people. He still refuses to deal with the fact that it's part of evolution, and instead he says absurd things like that evolution should cause dogs to give birth to animals that are no longer dogs.
Of the creation, they don't understand what that creation was like. They're ignorant of the flood, and they're ignorant of the coming judgment of God.
A book saying that in the future people might not believe the book isn't terribly impressive, nor is it scientific evidence. Evolution is a part of science, and no matter how true or not any part of the Bible is, science is about empirical evidence, and that's not what the Bible is. If something the Bible says is true, and it's open to scientific investigation, then science will back up the Bible. But what can't happen is that science assume the truth of the Bible. That's simply not science at all.
There's a judgment. Most Christians are ignorant of the flood. They don't understand.
I haven't surveyed all Christians or anything, but I would hazard that nearly 100% of them are aware of the story of Noah's flood. It's pretty famous.
One atheist said, do you think there's enough water on the earth to cover the whole world?
There is not, no.
I said, well, theoretically, one drop would cover the whole world if you spread it real thin.
No, it would not. Let's do some math. Water molecules have a radius of 1.38 angstroms. An angstrom is 1/10 of a nanometer. Now, as we all know, the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared. So we have an area for a water molecule of 9.98 square angstroms, or 9.98 times 10 to the negative 10th meters squared. That's pretty small. Now, the average radius of Earth is 6,380 kilometers. We're keeping with three significant figures for this. Now, the surface area of a sphere is 4 times pi times the radius squared. So we get a surface area of Earth of 511 million square kilometers. So now to figure out how many water molecules we need to cover the whole Earth to a depth of one water molecule, we simply divide 5.11 times 10 to the 11th square meters by 9.98 times 10 to the negative 10th square meters, and we get our answer. So it would take 5.12 times 10 to the 20th water molecules to cover the whole Earth. Water drops can be as large as 4 millimeters in diameter, or 2 times 10 to the negative third meters. So we need to know how many water molecules can fit in one of those. We have the radius of the water molecule already, so let's turn it into a volume. We need to multiply the radius cubed by pi times 4 thirds. The radius is 1.38 times 10 to the negative 10th meters, and so we get 11.0 cubic angstrom, or 1.1 cubic nanometers. Now we have to get the volume for the water drop, and we do so in the same way. Assuming our maximum water drop size, we get an answer of 2.68 cubic millimeters. Now if we convert our volume of a water molecule to cubic millimeters for ease of comparison, we find that they are 1.1 times 10 to the negative 18th cubic millimeters. And we can now use simple division. We divide 268 by 1.10 times 10 to the negative 18th, and we get 2.44 times 10 to the 20th, which is a bit less than half as much as needed. So can a single drop of water cover the whole Earth? Nope, it cannot. And of course, even if we had 3 drops of water, no one would consider that much water, never mind a catastrophic flood.
They got upset about that, did all kinds of programs. So I did how many molecules are there in a drop?
Oh. I just did do that math. I don't think I was upset, though.
If you spread over the whole world, it'd be how many molecules per square inch? There's still enough to cover the whole world.
Not unless Hovind has invented new math. Although I will say that that is within an order of magnitude, so given that I like to give creationists a free order of magnitude, since they're usually off by more than 5 on most things, I guess technically I can't really complain. Kent is within an order of magnitude. So by the very low standards I have for creationists, he's right.
They believe the whole universe fit in a dot smaller than an atom.
Which wasn't made of water, or any matter at all. Matter is made up of particles called fermions, and one of the rules of physics, the Pauli exclusion principle, tells us that multiple fermions cannot simultaneously share the exact same quantum state. Part of that quantum state is their location, so you cannot infinitely squish fermions. However, at the Big Bang there were no fermions, only bosons, which can share quantum states, and so can be infinitely compressed without any problem according to physics as we understand it. So in complaining that people have called him out on being wrong about the size of water molecules, he points out that they believe something that's entirely consistent with physics as we understand it now. That's not really the own he thinks it is.
They get mad about me and my dot. I love picking on them.
I don't know what he means by that. After this, he lets people know that his cult compound needs a mechanic. That's not interesting to me, so I'm cutting it out.
Dr. Don Biddle has...
It's Dan, not Don.
Dr. Don Biddle has written done a great movie on the topic of Noah's flood.
That movie is The Ark and the Darkness, which I have not seen in its entirety, but when I find a copy online, I may have to look into it.
Been involved in the creation ministry for years. Brother, take it away. Tell us about your ministry, Genesis Apologetics, and how they get a hold of you. And tell us about what's the evidence for Noah's flood.
I'm going to cut past this contact info stuff. If you want to find Genesis Apologetics, just Google it. When I do it with all the sponsored links and AI bullshit turned off, it's the first result on the first page of the Google result.
So when we think back about Noah's flood, people have questions such as, did it really happen or is it a myth? Is it a mythology pulled from ancient Near Eastern texts?
Yes, it is. We can even see the progression of the origin of a flood myth in Sumerian king lists, with the earliest of them having no mention of a flood, but then there being introduced a division of post- and pre-flood kings, and then from there we get ideas like a worldwide flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, all of which predate the very existence of the Hebrew people as a distinct ethnicity.
Why did it happen? Why in the world would God send a flood, to wipe out the whole world? So why did that really happen?
Well, the internal narrative of Genesis says it was because humanity was so wicked and evil that God needed to start over. In older Mesopotamian myths, it was because humans were too noisy, and so the gods wanted to get rid of them. Genesis was mostly composed during the Babylonian exile, and so it is quite likely that this is when the idea of a global flood became a common idea among the captive Israelites, and they modified the story to make their god the one who caused the flood, and also changed his motives to be less arbitrary as a way to assert the superiority of their god over their captives.
When did it happen?
Never BCE.
Other questions really like, was it local or was it worldwide?
If there is a historical event out of which the story grew, then it was certainly local, because a global flood is physically impossible given the amount of water on Earth, and is precluded by numerous collections of data.
And then, of course, what evidence would exist if it really did happen?
At the very least, a globally correlated flood deposit that would probably be composed of graded turbidite, which is exactly what we do not see.
So we'll be going over answering those questions tonight.
I look forward to it.
So when was the flood? We can bracket it very accurately from our scholarship from Scripture. There's also a lot of archaeological evidence that will fit to bracket the flood.
Such as what? I'm not aware of any archaeological evidence at all that would even hint at the reality of a global flood. That's one of the reasons that archaeologists generally reject the idea of a global flood. They see continuity of cultures from the Paleolithic right on through to the Iron Age and beyond, with no obvious break in culture. And of course, the archaeological record goes back much farther than Dan thinks the world has even existed. Archaeology directly contradicts his ideas.
But if you just follow the Masoretic set of texts, which is the one that's used for basing the chronology that was borrowed by Bishop Ussher and some other people, it's the leading textual set that's used for our mainstream Bibles.
But what if I want to follow the Septuagint? I mean, they're both wrong, but at least with the Septuagint I can get a longer timeline, so it's less wrong. By the way, the Masoretic text is a Hebrew manuscript family, and the Septuagint is an older Greek translation. They do have variation between them, but it's not always clear if such variations represent the Septuagint relying on earlier manuscripts with earlier readings, or if it's a mistranslation. I tend to be of the opinion that where they vary and we do not have a third ancient witness like the Peshitta or the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Masoretic text is probably the more conservative of the texts. But if the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Peshitta both agree with the Septuagint, then I tend to think that the Septuagint is preserving the older reading. It doesn't much matter though, as in most cases the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are pretty similar.
It goes back to about 2348 BC. There are some interesting things you can do by looking at Abraham's lifespan and birth years that might park it back at 2518 BC.
Well, that sounds like an internal contradiction in the chronology of Genesis. Now that makes sense if you look at the data around Genesis, which indicates that it is actually a composite text with multiple sources that was compiled and edited long after the setting of the stories within it, and those stories were from different sources that do not always agree. On the other hand, if it's a literally accurate text, then it shouldn't matter which way you get the date of the flood. It should always work out to be the same year.
But just to again, for scholarship purposes,
no one who takes Dan seriously is someone who should be given the appellation scholar.
The Septuagint set of texts, there's a lot of academic credibility to parts of the Septuagint text, and the Septuagint would have Noah's flood happening about 3168 or right in that bracket BC. So
now this is interesting because Kent usually has no time for debates about the Septuagint versus the Masoretic text.
Hovind, why do you use the King James? Man, it's Old English, nobody can understand it, it's hard to read. When I was 16, I had the reviled substandard perversion of the Bible. It's here someplace, my original copy, but I was reading that, going to church, going to this little independent, temperamental, fundamental, right-wing, radical, chicken-eating Baptist church, and the preacher was banging on the pulpit saying the Bible's the Word of God, and I was making notes in my revised standard version. And after a couple of months, he said, Brother Hovind, you've been a Christian a few months now. It's time you get a Bible. I said, I got a Bible. He said, no, you need a real Bible. I was offended. He said, well, there's real problems with that one. So, why King James? There are very serious differences between these Bible versions. We've got a book, I don't know if I have it here, it's in our library. The guy sent it to me. It took me 6 months to figure out what the title said. The title was, Things That Are Different Are Not the Same. Wow, these Bible versions are definitely different, so you can't say they're the same.
See, he thinks we should simply rely on a politically motivated revision of the Bishop's Bible that use scant few texts compared to what we have today. So ordinarily, I would expect Kent to give pushback here, since according to him, we know exactly what the Bible says, and it's what the King James version of the Bible says. This won't be the last point where Dan says something that Ken would ordinarily argue against.
I'm not comfortable in saying that the flood really happened in that bracket range of time. It either happened at the Masoretic set of text or at the Septuagint years. There's not really a 1,000-year bracket somewhere in that range. It's either one or the other.
That's a pretty big difference in the scale of human history. If there were a flood at all, it seems like it would be pretty easy for archaeology to figure out which one of those is correct. Of course, since archaeology has no room for any global flood, it seems they're both incorrect.
So, but again, we have no problem with the younger date for Noah's flood, about 2350 BC or so.
Except that during this time, both before and after the alleged flood, the Mesopotamian early dynastic wars were going on. There was a continuous culture in the Indus River Valley, making distinct pottery both before and after this time, and the unification of Sumer was ongoing. We know that stuff wasn't interrupted in this time frame by a flood. This isn't some big question or mystery. People were just continuing to live their lives both before and after this period.
But we provide these different dates just for academic conversations. So,
Dan is part of academia the same way that Flat Earth University is a university.
That's about when it happened. If we go on, let's talk about the duration of the flood itself. So the Bible says that it was a 371-day event. I've actually had people at our talks get somewhat mad at me and say, Dan, what are you thinking? It was just 40 days, 40 nights. Man, we all know that.
Here, Dan is right. The Bible story has 40 days and nights as the duration of the rain, but not the duration of the time Noah was on the ark, which is indeed a bit more than a year.
And that's because most people have heard in Sunday school that's how long the flood was. And so that's what people are thinking. But if you track out the diary that Noah left in Scripture for us, it was a 371-day event.
There is absolutely no reason to think that Noah wrote any of Genesis, even if it were literally accurate history. Even if we go with the traditional Jewish and Christian idea about the authorship of Genesis, it's Moses, not a series of patriarchs passing along their stories. That is a modern innovation that seems to have started with young earth creationists. That idea is certainly not in the text of Genesis or anywhere else in any biblical canon that I'm aware of, and even the idea of Mosaic authorship is nowhere in Genesis. It has to be found in later books after that tradition had developed.
Many people would say if you look at the Hebrew of the text, the ark didn't even get buoyant until about day 40.
I very much doubt that Dan has any ability to look at the Hebrew of a text. But again, why isn't Kent giving pushback and simply pointing to the King James Version as the authoritative Bible, as he thinks it is?
So there was a lot of shallow sea flooding that was happening, that was going on. The coral reefs and things like that were getting wiped out.
Now, that is a very interesting point. Coral are animals in the same phylum as jellyfish, Cnidaria. Nearly all of them absolutely require shallow, relatively warm water to survive, and they have a maximum growth rate. The fastest growing corals have a maximum growth rate of 4 centimeters per year, with most maxing out at about half that. In 2020, scientists found a 500-meter tall reef near Queensland, Australia. Now, given ideal conditions and assuming that this reef is composed entirely of the fastest growing coral known, it cannot be younger than 12,500 years old. But if the flood killed all the reefs, which it absolutely would have, and we just ignore that means all coral would have gone extinct, this reef had to establish itself after the flood and then grow at a rate of about 11 centimeters per year, nearly 3 times faster than the fastest growing coral. That would be like expecting humans to be fully grown at the age of 6 or 7. Just the existence of this one reef is enough to take the idea of a literal worldwide flood and toss it in the trash.
A lot of underwater tsunamis.
I'm not really sure what that means. Underwater, a tsunami is barely an event. It's just a sloshing of some water. Ships at sea don't usually even notice when a tsunami wave goes past them. It's only when the water becomes shallow and so the water is forced to rise up that the tsunamis become destructive. Does he mean tsunamis are generated underwater? Because that's basically just a tsunami. It's like saying an atmospheric hurricane. I guess it's not wrong, but it's weird.
A lot of action was happening in the first 40 days of the flood. The water was rising. The Bible is very clear in Genesis 7:11, which is the key verse to understanding the mechanics of the flood.
In case you're wondering, that verse is,
"In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened."
So this verse directly references concepts from ancient Near East cosmology. The fountains of the great deep are openings to the cosmic ocean, that is composed of the waters of chaos out of which God formed the world in Genesis 1. The floodgates of heaven are actual openings in the dome-like firmament over the flat earth that God also created in Genesis 1, and they keep out the waters of the great deep that are above the earth, except when God opens them to let water in. This verse is telling you that the way the flood worked is that Earth is surrounded by a cosmic chaos ocean, and that it's flat, and that both the top and the bottom have holes that God can open or close to let in or keep out the cosmic waters. Now, if you're wondering about air compression and the fact that that's not how physics works, don't worry. The ancient Hebrews didn't know that air was particulate matter that needed to be displaced. Of course, they also didn't know that the Earth was roughly spherical and that there was no dome, just a gradually thinning layer of air. Just this verse on its own, and its blatant contradictions with observable reality, should be more than enough to show that this is absolutely not a story that can be taken as literally true.
That on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep broke open. The Hebrew term is bakah, and it tends to mean cleaving, like a big cleaver, a meat cleaver happened, and the underwater fountains were broken up on the same day.
Well, I have no idea what Dan is talking about. The verb in that verse is niptahu, not bakah, so anything he has to say about this based on the wrong verb can be safely ignored. I guess I was right when I said he had no idea how to read Hebrew, because if he did, he'd notice that he's not talking about the right word in Genesis 7:11.
Then we have the zenith or the peak of the flood hitting about day 150.
No, it's not the zenith. The zenith is specifically the point on the celestial sphere that is directly above the observer. It's not used for other things normally. The peak of a mountain isn't a zenith. The high water mark of a flood isn't a zenith. The highest altitude of a flight isn't its zenith. It's not like this really matters much. It doesn't really change the validity of any of his arguments, nor does it make the historicity of the Ark story any more or less likely. But the thing is that it shows that this is not a man who knows what he's talking about. Dan's not a scholar. He doesn't care about things like accuracy, empiricism, or fundamentally about what's true. This is just a symptom of that. And yes, it can be used metaphorically, but this is supposed to be a presentation about how basically all of science is wrong, and Dan can fix that for us. He really shouldn't be using a scientific term in a metaphorical way to refer to some other concept entirely.
Then we have the water retreating off of the continents, first in sheet flow and then in channelized cuts. And that's how we get a lot of interesting features like Arches National Park, where you have all these high-rise geological pillars that are around. And that's because the water was sheeting first, making even more layers, and then it was coming off in channelized cuts.
But there's a problem with that. Rock arches and pillars can't support themselves while they're eroding unless they're already hardened rock. But that requires the water between the sediments to be squeezed out, either by drying or simply by settling, and for a cementing agent to also join these sediments. That's something that takes centuries or even millennia, not months. Once again, this is physically impossible in the time frame that we're given. In the winter 2024 edition of Creation Research Quarterly, Scott Dunn published The Clay Consolidation Problem and Its Implications for Flood Geology Models. Scott Dunn is not a creationist, but did publish in a creationist blog with strict formatting requirements in order to get the problem of lithification times into the creationist literature. The Redwall limestone is a famous formation in the Grand Canyon, and it's up to 244 meters thick. The lightest limestone, and therefore the quickest to lithify, has a porosity of 0.4. That is to say, only 60% of its volume is actually from calcium particulates and cementing minerals. The rest is water or air. This means that the original limestone ooze it formed from had to be about 549 meters tall at a minimum. Now, of course, the first problem is that it's physically impossible to deposit that in a flood, as lime deposits fastest in calm, low-energy, warm water, which is basically the opposite of a raging flood. And even then, it deposits at about 2 centimeters per millennium, meaning we're looking at a depositional period of about 30,000 years. But further, that sediment would take almost 30,000 years to compactify into the lightest possible form of limestone. That means that in the best case scenario for going from the start of the deposition of this formation to its current lithified form, we need about 60,000 years, which is only an order of magnitude longer than the whole age of the Earth, according to Dan and Kent. The lithification problem is the smallest for sandstone, which has quick lithification rates. And that's the rock we're talking about with the rock arches in Utah's Arches National Park. The tallest arch there is 34 meters. That could potentially lithify in decades, like 2 of them, using a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And of course, this presumes that the top of the tallest arch is literally the top of the sandstone, and the bottom is also the bottom of the sandstone. That's not true. There is sandstone below, and there used to be a fair bit above, so it really would likely take centuries. So this can't simply be runoff from the flood causing this. If it's the runoff from the floodwater that's supposed to have happened before the end of the just over 1-year Ark voyage, then the runoff would have been flowing across kilometers deep ooze, not rock, and the rock arches couldn't form at all. So once again, we have a reason to toss the flood in the trash.
That's a quick overview of the 371-day process of the flood.
So the overview can be summed up as multiple physical impossibilities with the requirement that the flat Earth be true. I can't imagine why so many people would reject the historicity of such an event.
We know that the Ark was sea capable. It didn't have to do anything but float. It wasn't motorized, didn't have any sails.
No, what we know is that a ship with the Ark's dimensions probably could have floated, but only provided that it used better shipbuilding techniques than were around in the 19th century for wooden boats. But honestly, the seaworthiness of the Ark is one of the least of the problems with the flood. If someone tried to convince you that actually in the year 1754 the entire Earth was invaded by starspawn, who were battling a time-traveling fraction of Yithians, who had decided to inhabit the bodies of a rhinoceros and hippos, who built bombers out of steel, I'm not going to ask if the bombers are aerodynamically sound. It's the least of my reasons for rejecting the historicity of that event.
Didn't have to do anything but stay buoyant for the 150 days that it was before it hit on land, and then Earth dried out eventually, and then people got off. So,
of course, even though I find the feasibility of the Ark the least of the problems with the story, the text does present us with a problem for the Ark, just not one that would be a problem for it staying afloat. According to the text, the ark, when finished and with the door closed, had only one opening at the top to let air in. The closest analog to the ark that we have now is livestock transport ships. They need carefully designed air circulation systems to prevent the buildup of methane and carbon dioxide, which could poison the livestock. The ark has just a hole up top. Even the ark encounter in Kentucky, supposedly built to demonstrate the feasibility of the ark and the flood story as a whole, actually has a modern HVAC system for air circulation and climate control, and if it didn't, it would turn into a death trap.
God was able to keep that ark afloat, keeping it away from the tsunamis and from the catastrophic rifting that was happening.
So now we're just adding miracles to the Bible. At that point, it's all just magic and outside the realm of science. Magic isn't empirical, and if you want to invoke it, I can't stop you, but you've left behind the idea of justifying your beliefs scientifically.
But it was a very, very large ship. It depends on the length of the measurement of a cubit, but it was somewhere between likely 450 feet and 510 feet, and then about 80 feet by 50 feet. So 3 stories covered with pitch on the inside and the out.
Now, some people have objected to this being covered in pitch because pitch is a petroleum product, and according to young Earth creationists, oil didn't really form until during the flood, so there would have been no pitch. I tend to think that a reasonable counter to this is the idea that it was actually tree pitch, which is a thick, sticky substance trees exude when injured to prevent infection and seal up the wound. The stuff dries into a waterproof substance, and I'm happy to say that the story means tree pitch.
It wasn't bitumen, it was definitely a tree product.
Well, I guess Dan and I are on the same page on this then. Fine by me.
And when you put that stuff on hot, I've done it before. I've tried it putting on spruce planks before. It dries like an epoxy, like a hot fiberglass epoxy.
Well, not exactly, but again, it's fine. I think this is a reasonable interpretation of the text, and I wouldn't use this as an argument against the historicity of the ark, especially when there are so many other problems that physically preclude it from being true. After this, he keeps going on about how tree pitch works, but since I don't really have anything to contest there, I'll cut it out.
So I'm going to make a bold statement to say that the whole of Scripture and all of its credibility depends on Noah's flood being a true event.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
And I'll say that's completely crazy. The Christian Bible has from 66 to 84 books, with the smallest number being the canon used by most Protestants and the largest number being the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It was written by multiple people at multiple times, and each book makes different claims, each of which could be true or not, largely independent of each other. For instance, the Gospel according to Luke indicates that around the time of Jesus' birth, Quirinius was the Roman governor, and this is true. But it also indicates that a census occurred in which people had to travel to the hometown of their ancestors, which is very much obviously not true. As not only are there no records of such a census, it entirely defeats the point of a census, which is to see how many people lived where. Asking people to travel for a census would not only be hugely disruptive to the local economy, which the Romans depended on for taxation, but it wouldn't even tell them how many people lived there. So even within a single book, we can find both historically accurate things and things that very obviously never happened.
We have several different Bible authors that have talked about it. We've got, writers like Peter and Paul, Jesus himself, Moses, of course, wrote about it.
Neither Jesus nor Moses wrote a single word of the Bible, and that's as for sure as we can possibly be. As for Peter, the authorship of 1 Peter is traditionally attributed to him, but that attribution is probably incorrect. As for Paul, he did in fact write some of the books in the Bible, although not all of the ones traditionally attributed to him.
The flood is mentioned in several different places of Scripture. So if it didn't happen, if it didn't happen in the way that even Christ himself described it in Matthew 24, where the water came and took them all away, we have a big credibility problem with Scripture.
Okay, but that's not a problem for science. Pointing out that science contradicts Scripture is a problem for Scripture, or at least your interpretation of it, not for science. For science to find something a problem, it has to actually be empirical data. Jesus being reported as believing in a global flood in the Gospels means literally nothing to science. This is specifically why anyone, atheists, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., can do science.
And that's why I think that it's a very important issue for Christians to understand.
I would say that science is indeed important for Christians to understand, and that people like Kent and Dan are actively holding them back from that.
We do have credibility for it. There's loads of evidence for it. And tonight, I think we're going to be covering some of the best evidence for it.
That means that anything not in this presentation is an even worse reason to believe in the flood than what was in the presentation.
Kent, you mentioned this verse when we talked about this at the beginning, 2 Peter 3:6. whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. There's a lot of different angles to look at this verse, and a lot of different translators put it different ways. I like this particular translation for this talk because it says, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water
At least he's using Kent's preferred translation, the King James.
perish. So there was a world that then was, that is no more. We're in world version number 2 right now, and that pre-flood world was an amazing place.
Right, that's the claim. This talk is supposed to be providing evidence. Are we going to get any of that anytime soon?
We even have evolutionists by Peter Ward here, for example, saying, hey, there looks like there was a time in the past, they call it the Carboniferous period.
The Carboniferous period. I don't think anyone has ever called it that. Carboniferous is not a hard word to say. It's not like it's Scansoriopterigidae or something.
We would just say somewhere in the past before the flood.
But I'd also like to note that he has pictured here some waterfowl, a weirdly horizontal stretched version of a picture of the sauropod Repetosaurus krausi by Nobutamura, a Meganeura, a Triceratops, and a pterosaur. Of the 5 animals, only the Meganeura is known from the Carboniferous.
Where the oxygen levels were different, they would make that argument. And we have these big flying creatures like pterodactyls or Quetzalcoatlus.
Right, and that's a problem. The geological evidence indicates that when the rocks of the Carboniferous were laid down, oxygen levels peaked at about 35% of the atmosphere, and have never been that high again. They went down immediately afterwards and then went up to a much smaller peak of about 25% in the middle of the Mesozoic, and declined until today, where we're at about 20% oxygen. What possible mechanism could cause the atmospheric oxygen of Earth to increase so much then drop off so precipitously in only a year or so? See, that's the problem. If we want to attribute all of the Paleozoic to the flood, as Biddle and Hovind do, then we can't just attribute the oxygen maximum of the Carboniferous to the pre-flood world, because for the same reason we know that the Carboniferous has lots of oxygen, we know that everything preceding that stage of Earth's history had less. This would actually result in a pre-flood world with far less oxygen than today, with the oxygen only peaking in the first few months of the flood. You don't get to accept that the evidence in the rocks of high atmospheric oxygen is valid without also accepting that the evidence of lower oxygen is also valid. According to Dan, it's valid, which means that the pre-flood world had less, not more oxygen than today. That, of course, means that the organisms that were alive in the Carboniferous that relied on high oxygen content in the air, like Meganeura, couldn't have survived at all before or after the flood. So I guess God created them during the flood, specifically to drown them in the same flood? That's a really weird thing for him to do.
Which has a 53-foot wingspan, and you know, the flight physics just don't work very well in today's Earth climate with a creature like that.
All pterosaurs lived during the Mesozoic, when oxygen levels were much lower than they were during the Carboniferous.
We've got sauropods that weigh 70, 80 tons that are growing up to 120 feet long.
I'm going to need a citation for that. At maximum, Quetzalcoatlus may have gotten to 230 kilograms. Giraffes, which are about as tall as Quetzalcoatlus, weigh some 680 kilograms at the high end. Overall, that means that Quetzalcoatlus only needed to oxygenate about a third as much body mass as a giraffe. Given the extensive skeletal pneumaticity, that is, the presence of air sacs in the skeleton connected to the respiratory system, that you find in pterosaurs, it's quite likely that pterosaurs had bird-like respiratory systems, which are much more efficient than those of most reptiles or mammals. So this animal would probably breathe just fine today. As for the flight characteristics, there is no reason to think that the density of the air was significantly different in the Cretaceous, so it would most likely have been able to fly just fine today. Indeed, in the Cretaceous, the oxygen levels were only 5 percentage points or so higher than today. So fine, maybe if you took a Quetzalcoatlus egg and brought it forward in time and raised it today, it would end up being a few kilograms lighter and a few dozen centimeters shorter. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff here.
God describes them. God actually brags about the sauropods,
which also had extreme pneumaticity like pterosaurs and are even closer relations of birds, meaning it's even more likely that their lungs were like the high-efficiency lungs of birds. Plus, unlike pterosaurs, they could afford to have a much slower metabolism and so a much lower need for oxygen per unit mass per unit time.
Calling him the chief of all of his creation, the first in a ranked list of all of his creation, says it's the biggest, baddest thing he ever made.
No, that's not in the Bible. What Dan is referring to is Job 40, which describes Behemoth, a giant chaos bull monster that represents the forces of chaos that are found on land in the wilderness, just like Leviathan is a giant sea serpent, chaos monster, that represents the chaos of the seas and cosmic ocean. It has far more to do with the Bull of Heaven from the Epic of Gilgamesh than it does with sauropods. And if you want a deeper dive, here's a discussion about it I did with biblical scholar Dr. Kip Davis.
It's got a tail that sways like a cedar tree.
Of course, part of the problem is that the verse here is quite possibly a biblical dick joke, because while it wasn't, as far as I can tell, a super common euphemism in Hebrew, it is a cross-culturally common one, and the verse is tightly connected to another verse about the loins, and further, the verb here can also mean stiffen. So a reasonable translation would be, he stiffens his penis like a cedar tree, which, could be any animal with a big penis. But of course, the more important thing is that even if we want to say that despite the verse not indicating it, that the meaning implied is that Behemoth has a big tail, well, given it's actually a giant bull monster, that seems pretty in line with that.
No one can approach it, and it's the chief of all of his creations. But that creature has got nostrils that are only about twice the size of a modern-day horse.
I see, and I'm sure that Dan has done the math on why this is a problem, right?
How do you get enough oxygen in a creature with 80 tons of meat and muscle that's gonna live and sustain? Maybe there was higher oxygen levels in the past. Maybe the barometric pressures were different.
Well, there were higher oxygen levels in the Mesozoic, although not that much higher. But that's still a problem. The same reason we know about oxygen levels being high in the Mesozoic are how we know that it was even lower back in, say, the Cambrian, and even lower before that. So that the pre-flood world could be reasonably characterized as hypoxic. Not exactly a lush paradise, is it?
We're never going to really know for sure, but we have some clues. We also have things like this massive dragonfly with a 2.5-foot wingspan.
Dragonflies are members of Odonata, along with damselflies. Meganeura, the pictured animal that he's talking about, are not dragonflies. They are griffinflies, or members of order Meganosoptera. Now, they are related, but they are also different. An easy way to tell them apart is that Meganosopterans have large paired appendages that extend from the rear of their abdomen called cerci. A more subtle but significant difference is that odonates have a notch or elbow called a nodus, about halfway down the leading or anterior margin of their wings, which both strengthens the wing as well as provides a fulcrum point for the wing to flex, allowing it to be flexible while strong. Meganosopterans lack this. Odonates also have a thickened and more opaque cell in their wing near the distal end called the stigma, or pterostigma, which helps weight down the wing slightly to increase stability in the wing while the animal is gliding, allowing odonates to stay aloft longer without expending energy to beat their wings. Again, Meganosopterans lack this. Now, I would not expect the average person to know about these differences or to notice them, but I would expect it from someone who is trying to argue that big dragonflies are somehow a problem for the scientific consensus.
Probably couldn't buzz around in today's Earth climate like it could before the flood.
Except that that's the thing. It couldn't buzz around before the Carboniferous, because oxygen was probably too low for an insect's passive respiration to allow such extreme size. But the Carboniferous is, according to Biddle, somewhere in the middle of the rising stage of the flood, meaning that this high oxygen content air is only in evidence for at best a few weeks or months. So was there a weird single generation of supercharged griffinfly that one time? What's the actual model for this? We know that we have rocks like banded iron from what he considers pre-flood layers that cannot even form at all in the presence of significant atmospheric or oceanic oxygen. Sorry, but all the evidence points to the fact that if Dan is right about our being able to infer oxygen levels from the rocks, and that the Phanerozoic is all rock from the flood, then Adam and Eve were created in a world with essentially no atmospheric oxygen, or at least far less than today. It also means that we didn't hit modern oxygenation levels until partway into the flood, at which point they shot past modern levels only to come back down to modern levels, rise back up a bit, and then come back down, all during the year or so long flood.
We also have things like these huge mushrooms, 20-foot tall mushrooms. Here's an artist's rendering of what that thing would look like. So we're talking about a tropical paradise.
I'm not sure what the argument is for Prototaxites. Big fungus there for... I don't know.
Huge mushrooms, big creatures, lush, designed for life, and then that creation.
That would have been an anoxic nightmare of nitrogen and carbon dioxide with an atmosphere that would suffocate any aerobic life forms.
Came and fell when we brought sin, death, and suffering into the world.
Animals are heterotrophs. They all feed by killing other living things. Unless animals didn't need to eat at all but somehow still didn't die, defying the first two laws of thermodynamics, there was death before the fall, even if all the animals were vegan.
We also have things like this 8-foot millipede.
At least this time he is correct that Arthropleura is a millipede.
That's not your average millipede. You're not going to find that thing in your bed sheets today.
I don't find regular-sized millipedes in my bed sheets. What kind of sty is Dan living in that his sheets are full of millipedes? I'll admit, I should tidy up more, but I can't imagine how disgusting Dan's bedroom is if that's a problem he has. Is he just sleeping on the ground in the woods? What world is it he lives in? Look, if you've ever heard of someone finding a millipede in their bedsheets, let me know. If you're the person, you don't have to admit it. Just leave it in the comments.
Huge creatures growing before the flood. And of course, here's our sauropod with those little tiny nostrils, and evolutionists are saying, yeah, you'd have a hard time getting enough air into that animal. So
yes, if it had a mammal-like or lizard-like respiratory system, that would be a problem. But we know just on the basis of the extensive air sacs through the bones and in the neck and tail, which by volume were both almost all air, that it didn't have a respiratory system like mammals or lizards. That being said, yes, it is also the consensus that when they lived, oxygen levels were higher than now, just not nearly as high as during the Carboniferous.
Maybe higher oxygen, maybe different pressures, but a lot of things make more sense in a pre-flood world than they do today.
No, this only makes sense as a result of deep time. Oxygen levels worldwide can't vary close to fast enough for this to work. And unlike what Biddle needs, we see oxygen going up and then down in the alleged flood rock. He needs a decrease in oxygen from the oldest rocks until today, but that's simply not what we see.
Magnificent creatures. And of course, we've got the flying pterodactyls.
It's pterosaurs. Pterodactylus is a single genus of pterosaur. Normally I wouldn't care, but Dan is pretending to teach science. He needs to get it right.
Some of them had wingspans documented now over 50 feet, with bodies that probably weighed north of 500 pounds.
No, that's the highest mass estimate for the largest known pterosaur. The vast majority were far lighter. In other words, rather than some pterosaurs being bigger than 500 pounds, the current consensus is that none of them were bigger than that, and virtually all of them were smaller. Can Dan get anything right?
In some flight physics estimates have said, you have to get 16-mile-an-hour winds just to get the toes up off the ground.
Yes, but those are older estimates made before we knew that pterosaurs launched into the air with the wings, not with their feet like birds. Pterosaurs probably couldn't have gone from standing to flying simply with their back legs. We even have ichnofossils that are likely pterosaur launches, where they dig in deeply into the ground. Further, we have evidence of wear in the shoulder joints of pterosaurs that is likely caused by using their shoulders as part of the liftoff procedure. Indeed, it's quite likely that this ability to stand quadrupedally and then launch with the same muscles as used in flight is a big part of the reason pterosaurs could get so big. A bird as big as an ostrich needs massive thigh muscles that are useless in flight in order to take off. A pterosaur needs big pectoral muscles, which are already useful in flight.
And so would probably fly better in a different Earth climate than what we have today.
Models of pterosaurs indicated they could fly just fine today, and while the Mesozoic did have more oxygen overall than we have now, there is no reason to think that pterosaurs couldn't breathe in our atmosphere. Just like humans used to the rich oxygen levels of low elevation regions can still manage to move to Colorado or Kenya and breathe fine after some acclimation.
There was a world that then was that is not today. Today's world is different.
Well, yeah, no one is arguing that the world presented in the fossil record, or more appropriately, worlds, are all the same as the world of today. But that's the reason why humans first suspected that deep time was a thing. Remember, none of this was expected by flood believers. The very idea of extinction was anathema to creationists until it became too obvious that many, if not most, fossil organisms simply didn't exist anymore. Dan is simply using post hoc accommodations for that data that directly contradicts the actual predictions made by people who believe as he does before the data came in.
So this is one of the leading questions we get. How do you get all those animals in the ark? That is actually, a terrible question to ask.
What a horrible attitude from someone who is positioning himself as an educator. People who ask questions are people who want to learn, and if a question is common, then it means it's an obvious problem that lots of people see with an idea, even if that idea has a solution. The fact that a teacher thinks a question is easily answered doesn't make it a bad question.
Because all it takes is a little bit of study to look at the animal kinds. And we've got scientists in the creation camp called baraminologists that study the original created kinds.
But the problem is that baraminologists don't actually use all the data. And they are fundamentally wrong that within their matrices, large distance between the data clusters indicate lack of common ancestry. You see, if you leave out relevant taxa, which baraminologists do routinely, or you simply don't have all the data on the taxa that have existed, which we know is the case, since the fossil record is incomplete, then you get clusters and gaps, simply because your data has gaps and the clusters do not represent the full picture. Because some possible data has been excluded, whether unavoidably or intentionally. This means that whether evolution is true or not, you will get the results of baraminology. Further, the conclusions of baraminology can be changed by just adding new taxa. Enough to do things like put humans in the same kind as chimps and orangutans.
A simple way to look at it is there are interfertile species, and if you go up from that, you even have what's called the family level.
Yeah, that could work as a definition if it was both positive and negative. If interbreeding meant yes, the same kind, and lack of interbreeding meant no, not the same kind, then sure. Now we have a way to tell what kinds are. They're basically the same thing as the biological species concept. But the problem is that humans have watched reproductive isolation arise in both the wild and in the lab. A famous example is the Ensatina salamander, a group of salamanders that goes around California like a ring. Each set of adjacent groups can interbreed with each other, until you go all the way around, and suddenly the salamanders from opposite sides that meet back in the middle can't interbreed with each other, which creates a paradox in that each salamander is in the same kind as its neighbor, but the two ends of the ring are in different kinds, even though they're also in the same kind. So creationists typically say that breeding compatibility is positive indication that organisms are in the same kind, but lack of compatibility doesn't indicate that they're in different kinds. Well, this saves the Ensatina salamanders from a kind-based paradox, but it also means that humans could be in the same kind as daffodils. Creationists can't have that, which is why they make up silly nonsense about baraminology, where they pretend that their results are actually meaningful, even though they're really not. There simply is no definition of kind that can be proposed that is both meaningful and for which there is no evidence of organisms switching kinds. This is because fundamentally special creation just isn't true when it comes to life. Or if it is, then God really arranged all of biology to look like it's not.
Of biology, and you've got like Canis lupus familiaris, which is the wolf kind.
Canis lupus familiaris, huh? Well, first it's familiaris, but second, let's look at that. You might remember learning about binomial nomenclature in school. It's the system invented by Carolus Linnaeus in which all living things are identified by a genus name and a species name. The genus name comes first and is always capitalized, and the species name follows and is never capitalized. Also, both should always be in italics when printed and underlined when handwriting. After the first time using a genus name in a text, you can abbreviate it to just the first letter and a period, like in shortening Tyrannosaurus rex to T-Rex, which should always be spelled capital T period R-E-X, and ideally should be italicized. If you have multiple genera in a text with the same first letter, you can abbreviate to the first two letters instead. That's all well and good, but Dan used 3 words, Canis, lupus, and familiaris. What's the third one? Well, it's the subspecies. That is a population within a species that are more related to each other than other populations within the species, and which have a distinct morphology, but not so distinct that they are no longer the same species. Usually members of different subspecies can readily interbreed and often do so in areas where the ranges of the subspecies overlap. So we have Canis, the genus. Canis is split into many species, such as C. aureus, the golden jackal, C. latrans, the coyote, C. lupastor, the African wolf, C. lupus, the gray wolf, C. lycaon, the eastern wolf, which may or may not be valid, C. rufus, the red wolf, and C. simonensis, the Ethiopian wolf. Next we get to lupus. C. lupus is the gray wolf. That species has many subspecies, including albus, the tundra wolf, Arabs, the Arabian wolf, campestris, the steppe wolf, chanco, the Himalayan or Mongolian wolf, dingo, the Australian dingo and New Guinea singing dogs, Italicus, the Italian wolf, Lupus, the Eurasian wolf, Palipes, the Indian wolf, and Signatus, the Iberian wolf. There's one final one, though, Familiaris, the domestic dog. So what Dan is saying is that specifically, the domesticated dog is a kind. Of course, he's also saying that kinds are at the family level. So Dan is a person who thinks he can teach people the truth about biology, but who confuses families with subspecies. I cannot express in words how little Dan understands what he's talking about. He might as well be phonetically memorizing his lines in a foreign language he doesn't understand, like the old man in Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom.
They says, we must pray to their evil god.
You can get 339 dog breeds from the wolf, but it's hard to go back to the wolf because you're losing genetic information.
Of course, information, the other word besides kind that creationists love to use but hate to define in a meaningful way. I would actually argue that dogs have more information than other wolves, especially given that they have extra facial muscles that make their eyes more expressive to better interact with humans, and they also have extra amylase genes which help them better digest the starch-rich food that they eat because of their close association with humans. Also, what would it mean to get back to a wolf? Dogs are wolves in the same way that they're mammals or vertebrates. Could you breed a dog that was genetically identical to the modern Iberian wolf? Well, no, probably not. Because the mutations in the two populations are not linked, you probably can't bring them back together without just breeding them together. But could you create a dog breed that is morphologically and behaviorally virtually identical to an Iberian wolf? There's no reason to think you couldn't. You just had to breed for the behavior and morphology that you want. I won't really address the information thing unless he actually talks more about it. Just know that there is no rigorous way to compare the information in dogs and wolves and then conclude that wolves have more, and that that's in some way significant to evolutionary biology and its applicability to organisms broadly.
As you do speciation and selective breeding and things like that. But Noah didn't have to bring all of the different dog breeds, golden retrievers and Dachshunds and everything on Noah's Ark. He just had to bring one pair of wolves.
Not according to Dan Biddle. Noah would need one pair of each subspecies, so we're looking at more like 10 pairs of wolves. But even if it's just one pair of wolves that gets us all the wolves today, that still means some 35 pairs of canine, because that's how many living species there are. Except that, wait, there are plenty of extinct ones too, so really Noah is probably going to need a couple hundred canines on the Ark. This is why creationists tend to say the kind is a family level, which makes it weird that while Dan mentioned families, he's talking as if the kind is really at the species or subspecies level.
To breed all the different dog kinds we have today.
But what does he mean by dogs? So one pair of wolves can now make new kinds, so kinds can give rise to new kinds? That seems to negate the need for separate ancestry entirely. Dan is even worse at keeping his own bullshit together than Kent Hovind is, and that's saying something.
Same thing is wonderful about horses. You can take the smallest horse today and a Clydesdale, one of the largest horses. They're still interfertile. They're still the same family, same kind.
They're the same subspecies, Equus ferus capillus. Of course they can interbreed. So what? We've already seen species split into groups that can't interbreed, so whether they could or not doesn't help us draw the lines around kinds. I guess we can say that all horses share a common ancestor that was a horse, something evolutionary theory would also require. But the question is, do horses share common ancestors with other animals, like rhinos and tapirs, or more distantly with cows and whales, or yet more distantly with wolves and pangolins? Evolution says yes, and there are fossils and genetics to back that up. Creationism says no, and has nothing to back it up other than bias and wishful thinking.
Bears are really interesting because in the Ursidae family of bears, you have 5 of the 8 species within that family are actually still interfertile. You can breed a black bear with a polar bear with a grizzly bear, for example. They're all still interfertile.
But what about the ones that aren't? Can you breed a spectacled bear with a black bear? No. So are they different kinds? He seems to be arguing no, because this time he's decided to call the family a kind, it seems.
Chickens, same thing. 68 breeds. All he had to bring was a pair of chickens.
And now he's back to a subspecies, Gallus domesticus. So kind is somewhere in between family and subspecies. That seems a bit nonsensical, and it also means that organisms can breed with members of other kinds in some cases, and even can produce new kinds. I feel like Kent wouldn't agree with any of that, and yet he's strangely silent. It's almost like Kent is too stupid to understand what Dan is saying here. I suppose Dan probably is too.
When you start taking the spidery tree of animal biology today and pairing it back to the common family level kinds,
which are also sometimes species and sometimes subspecies, because Dan doesn't know the difference between those words.
You're looking at only thousands of types of animals that had to be on Noah's flood or on Noah's Ark for all this to work.
That would be a meaningful statement only if the word kind had a meaningful definition. It doesn't.
So here's some key flood verses. As I mentioned, Genesis 7:11 really is the key.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Before we really get into this, you might notice that I'm kind of a bee. Well, that's in part because people voted for it, but the reason I had a bee person hanging around ready to be in this video is because of a little thing called the World of Colony by Hexahedron Studios. I am not getting any money from them or any other reimbursement, and they don't even know that I'm doing this. Giving them a shout out, that is. Anyway, check out their YouTube channel for excellent digital paintings and really cool music to do with their world-building project all about bug people, where the biology of insects is actually taken into account. Now that that's out of the way, I guess it's time to talk about Dan Biddle. When last we looked at Dan Biddle's appearance on Kent Hovind's YouTube channel, Dan was about to dive into Genesis 7, verse 11, which, much to my disappointment, isn't about slushies and scratch tickets, or items that are only stocked so that the store can advertise that parents on food assistance can use said food assistance there, and that are never actually sold, like blocks of frozen juice concentrates that I know firsthand are usually a year or more expired. To my non-American viewers who do not know what I'm going on about, don't worry too much. 7-Eleven is a store in the USA, although it does exist in some other countries. Anyway, let's see what a verse that only makes sense if the Earth is a flat disk with a dome over it surrounded by a cosmic ocean has to tell us about why this flood super duper really happened, you guys. I'm totally serial.
First of all, we see here that it's not written like a mythology book.
It literally has a god flooding a flat Earth by opening windows in the dome he placed over the Earth to keep out the waters of chaos. I'm not sure how much more mythological it could possibly get.
It's written like a history book in the 600th year of Noah's life.
Here's a fun fact: the line between mythology and history isn't drawn based on whether or not the text gives dates.
And we're going to spend time at the end of our talk talking about exactly how those guys would live so long back there. We have some really good statistical evidence of exactly why that happened.
First, I highly doubt that. Second, last time I saw him make an argument like this, his whole argument was that the ages fit into an exponential decay curve really well, which, isn't evidence it's real. It's evidence that if it were real, whatever was causing the decline in lifespan caused exponential decay. Or it's evidence that the authors of the text kind of like to have people dying younger by about the same percentage in each generation. They were mostly making up.
And he says, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the fountains or the windows of heaven were open. So
put your predictions for how he interprets floodgates of heaven in the comments. If you get it right, then you win 2 internets.
What is going on here? The key is that the flood started on the ocean floor.
Not according to Genesis 7:11. Earth was taking it from both ends like Dan's mom, according to the text. Both from the heavens and the oceans, since that's probably where the authors would have located the fountains, since otherwise, how did all that ocean water get there?
And then it didn't peak until about 150 days into the flood.
Again with the weird use of zenith. I mean, it's not the worst thing, it's just super weird to me.
And the whole of Earth was covered. 15 cubits upward did the water prevail, which is about 22 feet by a conservative estimate. So wasn't a local flood.
I'll agree that the text, if taken literally, does indicate a global flood. But that doesn't mean there was a global flood, and it also doesn't mean that you have to take the story literally, or even that it was meant to be taken as such by the authors and the first audience to whom it was written. We know there certainly was no such flood that occurred, so if you want to maintain that the account is in some way historical, you're going to have to allow this verse to be hyperbole. There really aren't any other options that don't just leave you as definitively wrong if you want to accept the historicity of the story.
Was a whole swamp of the earth a global flood?
You know, at first I wondered why he even bothered, since I know what his claim is, but then I realized he's not just arguing that this claim is correct based on the evidence, he's arguing that it's the correct claim to make based on the Bible, and the reason I don't care is that this talk isn't for me. It's not here to convince non-creationists. It's here first and foremost to keep young Earth creationists being young Earth creationists, but also secondarily to convince sympathetic Christians who are on the fence that he has the correct theological position.
Here's a short animation we're going to show of not a guess theory, but I'm going to say we actually know how it happened. We have the physical evidence.
That's a big claim. I wonder if he can back it up.
Of how these fountains of the great deep breached and broke open. It's actually quite obvious still on Earth today, and I'm going to show you what that looked like next. So,
weird how we seem to be just ignoring the floodgates of heaven. Those seem important according to Genesis 7:11. In fact, they're one of the 2 sources of water mentioned, and nothing I can see in the text seems to indicate that they're a source of significantly less water than the fountains of the great deep. Do you think he just doesn't want to talk about the fact that the book he thinks is literally true depicts a solid dome with windows in it over the flat Earth?
On the ocean floor, we have this oceanic rift starting as the hot lava comes up, breaches with these big linear underwater rifts, pushes up these linear steam jets that are supercritically heated water, and those are going to send tsunamis and waves all the way up onto the land continents as it's going. So
there are a couple problems with this. First, that doesn't actually add to the amount of water on Earth, because the water that comes up through the deep sea vents was just water from the ocean in the first place. There's no mechanism for a huge amount of bulk water to just appear in a lava flow to get added to the hydrosphere. Second, tsunamis leave behind tsunamite. That's a kind of rock that's recognizable, and Dan thinks this is the event that laid down most of the Paleozoic rock. But most Paleozoic sedimentary rock has not been shown to be tsunamite. Dan sure hasn't done any geology, but even pseudoscientists who do pretend geology for creationists like Taz Walker, Steve Austin, and Andrew Stelling have not to my knowledge ever claimed that they found any tsunamite at all in the Paleozoic, never mind the global deposits that this idea would require.
The underwater, the lava's going to come up, it's going to cool, it's going to turn into new seafloor, then it's going to spread.
Yes, that is how seafloor spreading happens.
but we also know what rate it happens at. And the current rate that's measured specifically by measuring how far apart the sides of the Atlantic are drifting each year. This lines up with measurements from radiometric dating, which also line up with the paleomagnetic record from sources within human archaeology, at least within the range of the human archaeological record. We would need some compelling evidence to allow for seafloor spreading at the speed that Dan needs. And of course, this is a source of heat, a lot of heat. But I think we'll hear more about that later.
That it's going to hit the land continent and dive underneath it.
No, the seafloor that's spreading is not generally the seafloor that's subducting. It's the oceanic crust on the opposite side of the continents from the spreading that subducts. There's a reason that the Atlantic is spreading and the Ring of Fire is around the Pacific. It's because the subduction is around the Pacific, which is shrinking.
And start buckling and folding the land as it goes down. We know that's exactly what happened with the Farallon Plate right off of the coast of California.
That's true.
So, and as it cools and the gods shut the fountains off, the water sheets right back off again.
Okay, but that's not going to get you to a flood. There isn't currently enough water to cause a flood. You need a source of water to enter the hydrosphere and then a way for it to exit the hydrosphere. And while volcanic vents do add water to the hydrosphere, it's only in the very short term, because they also took that same water from the hydrosphere. So there's no net gain. Where did it come from? Where did it go?
Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe?
So that's a quick overview of the mechanism of the flood. We have the hot magma coming up. It creates new seafloor. It spreads from the left to the right. It's going like a conveyor belt. It hits the land, dives underneath it.
Okay, so the mechanism is a version of seafloor spreading which has never been observed or indicated at speeds that would dump enough heat into the oceans to boil them, which are themselves magically producing supercritical water, which is going to be steam when it hits the air. So Noah is steamed alive. Wow, this sounds like Dan never bothered to actually work out the math for this, or learn anything about geology, or in any way think through the implications of this. He's just making it up as he goes. It's a lot like catastrophic plate tectonics, but at least the CPT people know that the subduction is occurring opposite the spreading, even if they do acknowledge that they have a severe heat problem and absolutely no way short of magic to get rid of it.
And causes tsunamis that are happening in cycles over and over and over again.
That leave no trace at all, which seems super plausible.
And the quick answer to what proves the flood in 30 seconds or less is that we have 14 states where the dead dinosaurs buried in the middle of America, millions of them buried with marine life in a 14-state, 600,000 mile, 300-foot thick pancake of over 600,000 cubic miles in a 300-foot thick mud pancake.
No such pancake exists, whether made of mud or flour, eggs, milk, baking powder, sugar, salt, and butter. What he's describing is just the area in the USA with the most Mesozoic sedimentary rock, which is, where you'd expect to find most non-avian dinosaur fossils, since where else would you find them?
And they're buried in 3 products: mud, sand, and ash.
Weird, because there's also shale in the Aguja Formation, which has dinosaurs. The Austin Chalk of the Gulf Coast has had dinosaurs found in it. It's limestone. The Coon Creek Formation has dinosaur fossils in marl. The Dakota Formation has dinosaurs in shale. The Demopolis Chalk is limestone and contains fossils of Appalachiosaurus, etc. Saying that dinosaurs are buried in mud, sand, and ash as if those are the only kinds of substances in which we've found dinosaurs is just incorrect.
And what you just saw is the only mechanism that's going to explain dinosaur taphonomy, or how these creatures were buried.
Except that it explains virtually none of it, because essentially no dinosaurs are buried in tsunamite. They're buried in things like alluvial sandstone, lacustrine shale, marine limestone, etc. None of that is tsunamite. Taphonomy is already a science, and people spend decades studying it. Tsunamis are the explanation for essentially no dinosaur fossils.
Dr. Baumgartner has modeled this using his computer software.
Yes, he did, and he had to increase the thermal diffusivity of the rocks of Earth by several orders of magnitude in order to get it to work the way he wanted. Thermal diffusivity is a measure of internal heat transfer. Basically, if you put the business end of a metal spatula on the burner of your stove, how long does it take until the handle is also burning hot? It is defined as the thermal conductivity of the substance divided by the product of its density and specific heat capacity. Thermal conductivity is much like electrical conductivity, except that it measures how fast heat transfers rather than how well electricity transfers. Density is, as you probably know, the mass of an object divided by its volume. and specific heat capacity is the amount of thermal energy needed to increase the temperature of a mass of a specific substance by a particular amount. For example, water has a specific heat capacity of 4.184 joules per gram per Kelvin, meaning that it takes 4.184 joules of energy to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water by a single degree Celsius or by 1 Kelvin, which is the same change in temperature. Thermal diffusivity is a property of a substance that does not simply vary. Under the same conditions, the same substance will always have the same thermal diffusivity unless the laws of physics change. Since the laws of physics are what they are, Baumgartner's model is physically impossible based on current scientific understanding.
He got his PhD from geophysics from UCLA over 40 years ago. He came up with the software model, and people are using this to find oil.
Well, kind of. The modeling software is called Terra, and it has been used in a modified form to model plate tectonics by people other than Baumgartner, and it was modified because the original version didn't actually give realistic results. It's not clear what version Baumgartner used, but it is clear that he had to drastically alter the physical properties of the Earth to get his desired outcome. And yet, if you simulate a version of Earth that isn't the real version of Earth, I'm sure you can get all sorts of weird results. But those aren't applicable to the real Earth, just the fake one that you made up.
It's an amazing thing. It's all based on young Earth creation ideas about Noah's flood.
No, it's not. It's just based on some basic physical parameters and how they interact. Like any simulation, if you put in garbage, you get out garbage. Baumgartner wanted to find a flood, so he put in nonsense parameters to get a flood. And he got a flood. There should be no surprise about this. It doesn't mean anything because it's always been known that if you fiddle around with a simulation, you can get pretty much anything you want.
We had a Pangea-like formation of the continents that used to be together. The fountains of the Great Deep break open, and it began a 40,000-mile linear network of these fissures of the oceanic ridge that goes around the Earth 1.6 times total. There's a 40,000-mile network of these oceanic ridges, or the mid-Atlantic ridges.
And these rocks do not show evidence of having been heated enough. You see, rock moving requires energy, which you probably are not surprised by. When a rock moves, it generates heat from friction, and when the rock stops, all the energy used to move it will be transferred to heat, which means you can figure out how much thermal energy a moving continent would dump into the environment. As an example, the North American plate has a mass of about 40.7 times 10 to the 21st kilograms. The Atlantic Ocean is about 4,800 kilometers across, and the North American plate would have to move about half that distance, or 2,400 kilometers. If we assume that this happens over half a year, that's about 3,383 hours, so we have a speed of 0.7 kilometers per hour, or 0.2 meters per second. So that mass moving at that speed has 4 zeta joules of energy, which is a strange number. So let's put it in terms of how much water you could boil with that if you started with some water at 0 degrees Celsius. It takes water 2,257 kilojoules per kilogram to boil water that's at 100 C. It takes 41.840 kilojoules to take 1 kilogram of water from 0 to 100 degrees Celsius. So to take a kilogram of water from 0 Celsius to steam takes 2,298.84 kilojoules. So now we take 4 zetajoules and we divide it by the 2,298.84 kilojoules per kilogram, and we get 1.74 times 10 to the 15th kilograms of water boiled off the oceans. And that's just one source of heat for one continent. But it gets worse. We can't simply ignore friction. Now, doing an actual full friction calculation would be pretty complex, but we can be generous and say that if a continental plate were accelerated to 0.2 meters per second, it would take about 10 seconds to come to rest. I suspect it's actually much closer to 1 second or less, but hey, I'm being nice. That means that every 10 seconds or so, those same 4 zetajoules are shed to the surface. That means that there are over 1.5 million such 10-second periods in the course of half a year or so. So really, over the course of the flood, a much more reasonable, but still absurdly lowballed figure for the amount of water boiled off would be 2.74 times 10 to the 21st kilograms, or 2.74 yotograms, or, almost exactly twice the mass of the entire water on Earth, which is only about 1.4 yotograms. Again, that's just for North America. Eurasia and Africa are even heavier, and we also have South America and Antarctica. This idea would boil the ocean many times over, under even the most generous assumptions. There's no evidence that this heat ever existed, and as you probably know, that is far from the only source of heat that most flood models involve. This idea simply does not correspond to the past of Earth.
And we have the one here, the main one, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, right out in the Atlantic. that has a 10,000-mile strip of where it was cut there.
It wasn't cut.
You can see it's quite obvious how it pushed these two continents apart.
Yes, but it's physically impossible that it did it during the flood year. And we know it didn't because we don't have any evidence of the heat that would have been shed to the rest of the Earth. The only conclusion is that the Atlantic was pushed apart slowly enough that it probably took a few tens of millions of years.
We know that because we can correlate the fossils and the oil chemistry. We can bring these, when you bring those continents back together, right there where they would join at that big baseball seam-like tear, we have things that are correlated, indicating that they used to be together, but they were rapidly spread apart and catastrophically spread apart. You can go to Google Earth and see that today.
We still have these scars, fault lines. I've been to the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault, the Golden Fault. None of them my fault, but I've been there, done that, studied it, okay? There's no question the Earth has cracks. The question is, when did this happen? Well, the textbooks in school say this is part of the Pangea theory. The continents are moving around. Well, I agree the continents are moving a little bit, but the Pangea theory is baloney. They shrank Africa 40% to make them fit. They took out all of Mexico and Central America. Hey, señor, ¿qué pasa? ¿Dónde está Mexico? Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala. They don't tell the kids, if you take the water out of the oceans, you'll notice there is dirt underneath. People say, hey, do you think the continents were connected? I say, what are you talking about? They still are. What do you mean, were they? Hello? Always have been connected. They're still connected. What do you mean, were they? Cover more on that on video number 6.
So does Kent still disagree with this? I haven't heard him say so, but he certainly at one point thought that this was nonsense. That's a bit strange that he would just platform something that, as far as I know, he thinks is a lie. It's one of his lies in the textbook.
But here's a bathymetric map on the right, which is just a map with the water taken off. And you can see quite obviously how the fountains of the Great Deep were instrumental in pushing these continents apart.
Except that the fountains of the Dahomey or Great Deep are openings to a cosmic ocean of water, not a bunch of lava, which is what these mid-oceanic ridges are. You just have to make stuff up and shove it into Genesis in order to say that the fountains are actually volcanoes. We can see that the Great Deep is water and not lava in multiple places in the Bible. We have in Isaiah 51:10,
Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a pathway for the redeemed to cross over?
Here the Great Deep is basically just the water crossed in Exodus. In Amos 7:4, we read,
So the Lord God showed me, and behold, the Lord God was calling to contend with them by fire, and it consumed the great deep and began to consume the farmland.
How does fire dry up lava? It doesn't. Clearly the Great Deep isn't something like a volcano. Jonah 2:5 says,
Water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me. Weeds were wrapped around my head.
Notice that Jonah almost drowned. He didn't burn to a crisp in lava. Consistently throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the Great Deep is associated with the ocean and water. It's not fire, it's not steam, and in Genesis, the function of the fountains of the Great Deep is just to increase the volume of water on Earth and later to drain it away. Interestingly, this solves the problem of there not being enough water for the flood to happen, although at the cost of requiring a flat Earth cosmology that doesn't even have time zones. So, you win some, you lose some.
So let's look at it a little bit more. So you've got the hot lava that comes up.
Contradicting what we find in Genesis, yes.
It forms new seafloor and it spreads, and it's going to be pushing these two continents apart. For example, at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, but it pushed a lot of the continents apart.
Yep, no one disputes that. The question is, can you cram it into a year or so?
So when that seafloor spreads, it's going to hit the land continent and bind and develop pressure and tension.
No.
Nope. Again, the subduction is going to be on the opposite side of the world, as evidenced by the lack of volcanoes on the east coasts of North and South America and the west coasts of Europe and Africa. But the abundance of volcanoes on the west coasts of North and South America, as well as on the east coasts of Asia and Africa. Like, a simple glance at a map of volcanoes around the world should be enough to show that Dan doesn't know what he's talking about.
Then when it releases, it's going to send a tsunami out to sea and out to land in two different directions. And that was going on every so many minutes during the peak part of the flood, during the first 150 catastrophic days of the flood.
All while leaving behind essentially no tsunami deposited rock. How strange. And of course, animals buried by a tsunami are generally rather shattered. Yet in some cases we find quite intact fossils. The famous fighting dinosaur fossils of a velociraptor and a protoceratops locked in combat were found in air-deposited sand, and the fossils are both essentially intact. How did that happen during a tsunami? Did the tsunami have a gentle air pocket to allow sand to blow into the dunes, only for it to crash down with the force of a feather to prevent the compaction and therefore the damage to the soon-to-be fossils of the Geological formation? That seems rather far-fetched.
We have the seafloor subducting, it's binding, gaining tension, and releasing, and that turned into a tsunami-making machine.
I mean, yes, it still is one. That's how a lot of Pacific tsunamis happen.
That was coming up on the land and burying these creatures in layers, and that's exactly what we see them buried in today.
Layers, yes, but if you leave it there, you're lying by omission. Are they all buried in tsunamite or any other kind of turbidite? No, they're not. No one says that there shouldn't be multiple layers of rock containing fossils. The question is, what can we predict about those rocks? And Dan's idea predicts that all of them will be formed in high-energy deposits, and in some cases catastrophically high-energy deposits. Instead, they're frequently found in things like tidally cross-bedded sandstone, revealing that it took years or even millennia of tides to form the rock in question, or limestone that accumulates at a few centimeters per millennium, yet is in deposits hundreds of meters thick, or in fine-grained, non-flocculated shale that also has to deposit slowly in low-energy environments. It will be hard for the world to look less like a young one that had suffered a global flood a scant few thousand years ago.
And layers. So, for example, when a subduction-related slip happened in Japan, look at the effect of the tsunami.
Oh no, 25-centimeter waves on the west coast of the Americas. At least he's not pretending that this is the radiation leakage like I saw in lots of memes on Facebook shortly after the tsunami. That was annoying. I can't tell you how many people I had to tell that the scale was in meters and that that's not how you measure radiation.
This was a 60-foot seafloor slip. It had been binding tension for thousands of years since the flood, and then it released. The seafloor slipped about 60 feet. And when it did, over in Japan, we see the effect. That tsunami reached the shores all the way over to the Americas.
I mean, yes, it did reach the Americas, but it was like knee height for most people. That's just going to be kind of a tall wave one day. It wasn't exactly a force of destruction by the time it got to the Americas. Maybe he should have focused on the damage it actually did in Japan, where it was by far the worst.
Spread thousands of miles going over, and of course, it wreaked havoc on Japan.
Oh good, he got there.
Burying hundreds and hundreds of people, and they still can't find many of them. So that's an example of what one subduction-related tsunami can do. But these tsunamis were happening over and over again in like a cycle, in like a mill, just going on for about 150 days during the flood.
Right, no one is disputing that this scenario would have been unbelievably destructive. It's just that there isn't evidence that it happened. So far, literally the only evidence that we've been shown is Dan misunderstanding, if I'm being generous, taphonomy as the stratigraphic column, and John Baumgartner pretending that he can just alter the physical properties of Earth at will in a simulation and therefore learn something about the real Earth. In other words, no evidence at all. Harping on about the destructiveness of the scenario doesn't do anything to help.
And isn't it also interesting that one translation takes Genesis 8:3 and looks at it this way? And the waters receded from the earth, going forth and returning.
The only translation I can find that has this rendition is the Legacy Standard Bible, a translation released in 2021. The NIV says receded steadily. The NLT says gradually receded. The ESV says receded. The BSB says receded steadily. The KJV has returned from. The NKJV says receded continually. The NASB says receded continually. The AB says receded steadily. The CSB says steadily receded. The HCSB says steadily receded. The ASV says returned. The ABPE says returned. The BST says subsided. The CEV says slowly went down. The Douay-Rheims says returned. Other phrasings include began to recede and gradually went down. Literally only one translation says anything about going forth and returning. He's shopping around for a translation he likes because he knows that the other translations don't give his idea of cyclic tsunamis any comfort. So the Hebrew verb is yashubu, which means recede. The other word of significance is halok. Please forgive my Hebrew pronunciation. This word means to go, walk, or come. So an overly literal translation would be, and the waters receded from the land, going steadily, and the waters decreased at the end of 150 days. There is just nothing about going back and forth, and even the Legacy Standard Bible's translation doesn't actually say that, since forth doesn't mean back and forth, it means forward or outward, but it's archaic. So the only association most people have with it is in the phrase back and forth, meaning backwards and forwards, implying some kind of oscillation. So let's see, the Hebrew doesn't say anything about cyclic tsunamis, none of the English translations do either, and only one obscure translation can even be twisted to kind of indicate that, even though when you actually read it, that's not what it means. Further, Kent is a KJV supremacist, so normally he'd object to someone using another translation to demonstrate a doctrine when that translation contradicts the KJV. Now, I don't actually think it does contradict the KJV, but Dan seems to.
And at the end of the 150 days, the water decreased. Look, I know there's a lot of dispute about Bible translations and different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, there is, and Dan's in the house of a KJV only guy.
But this is a valid translation of Genesis 8, chapter 3.
I agree, it doesn't say what Dan thinks it does. Dan is evidently bad at English, not just Hebrew.
What is it talking about? Tsunamis.
That's a stretch.
Stretch Armstrong.
Literally nothing in that verse in any English translation I can find, or in the Hebrew, in any way indicates that there was a tsunami. In fact, I asked biblical scholar Kip Davis, and he said that the closest he could come to interpreting Genesis 8:3 is that the steady water decrease was actually steady rising and falling in the tides with a net decrease in water. And that's with him trying to find a way to reconcile this interpretation.
Right there in Scripture, we have the water receded from the earth, going forth and returning.
Right, going forth from the land to return to the ocean. This is nothing about the water coming onto land. That already happened earlier in the narrative.
The Scripture itself talks about the fountains of the great deep breaking open. That's a very mechanical explanation.
I mean, it is. It's just that there's no actual great deep that can provide additional water as conceptualized in the Bible.
And here we have yet a second mechanical explanation. The water's going forth, returning, going forth, returning.
That's just a lie, though. He's lying about the Bible. I get it when he lies about the science. He just doesn't care about science. But lying about the Bible? That's the very thing he's supposed to be most concerned with.
And then after 150 days, the waters came down and that tsunami mill was stopped. Remember here.
Yes, remember here that there would be no water. The oceans would have boiled like 10 times over just from the heat generated by the continents spreading apart. And of course, remember that these tsunamis can't deposit many kinds of rocks like we find, such as evaporite, Aeolian sandstone, etc. And we don't have ubiquitous tsunami, and even if we ignore all that, we don't have enough time for the rocks deposited by the flood to lithify in order for the flood runoff to create arches and steep-walled canyons.
You guys, Scripture says that God says, I will destroy them, corrupt humanity, with the earth. So God says, I'm going to use the earth as a tool to destroy humanity. And that's exactly what he did.
And then he made it look like doing so was completely physically impossible and never happened, which is a weird choice. Look, if your argument is that the flood left no physical evidence in biology or geology and no archaeological or cultural impact outside of the ancient Near East, then you can make that argument. I can't say it didn't happen because it's entirely unfalsifiable. But if you want to argue that there is any evidence that would actually lead someone to suspect the historicity of such an event, it's just not there. You have to believe it in spite of the evidence, not because of it. If, on the other hand, you prefer science and non-fallacious reasoning, then why not subscribe to this channel if you haven't already? Make sure to turn on all notifications so sometimes you might actually get a notification. Also make sure to like this video, as that's what really tells YouTube that you want to see more of my content. And not just you, it also increases how much I pop up in the feed of new viewers too. You can directly help the channel grow, and all it takes are some free clicks.
He recycled Earth's surface right underneath. He destroyed it in a very, very catastrophic way.
And in order to show that all Dan has done is give us scenarios in which, in order to believe this, you'll need to simply ignore basic physics and math. And I mean, like, high school algebra. You don't even need logarithms for this, never mind calculus. Just some basic unit conversions, algebra, and some physics equations are all that's needed to show that this simply did not happen.
So let's look at a little bit more closely into the flood mechanisms and the resulting taphonomy.
Yay for fossils.
Taphonomy is the study of the conditions in which an animal,
any organism actually,
was buried and killed and fossilized.
That's true.
So here is the situation that evolutionists are stuck with. It's the most obvious thing in the world. If you have 5 minutes, want to take someone out to coffee and prove the flood, just take the picture of the slide. That's all you need when you understand what's really going on here.
I can't imagine how going to the PaleoDB map and filtering for just Mesozoic dinosaur fossil finds, then taking a screenshot of the continental United States would prove the flood, but let's find out.
This is the middle of America.
I mean, it's actually more to the west than in the middle, at least the part with the most dinosaur finds, but I don't think that's too important.
And we have a 14-state kill zone because every single one of those circles is not one fossil, not 10, not 100. Most of these are fossil bone beds.
That's not entirely accurate.
Actually, each of those dots is a single dinosaur find in virtually all cases, but the dinosaurs are found in a fossil-bearing formation that has other fossils, including other dinosaurs, just at different locations. You can actually check. Sure, some of the dots do represent mass graves, but most don't. You might think that the large circles on the map indicate more finds in a particular location, and that's kind of true, but when you zoom in, you find that they actually are simply more circles, each of which on its own is usually a relatively isolated dinosaur find.
Huge areas and swaths of regions where there's multiple hundreds or sometimes thousands, sometimes tens, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of fossils buried in these areas.
Fossils, yes. Dinosaur fossils, no. An area with millions of fossils will mostly have things like mollusk shells, plants, etc. Most strata with dinosaurs have a lot of other organisms too, and those organisms are usually more abundant than the dinosaurs.
But when you draw an oval circle around it, it's over 1 million square miles, 1,800 miles long, all the way up to Canada and Mexico. It encompasses parts of 3 countries, 14 states, 1,000 miles wide, 1 million square miles.
Wow.
I sure hope he has a point to this.
Of a dinosaur kill zone, right in the middle of America.
What a weird way to put that. It's like calling a cemetery a kill zone because you find a lot of bodies there. Organisms die everywhere, and their bodies end up in various places, often not exactly where they died. There's no reason to think that there was something special about this region, besides that it's the part of North America that has the most preserved Mesozoic sedimentary rock. West of it, and we get to mostly relatively new volcanoes, and to the east, you get rocks that have eroded down to mostly Paleozoic rocks capped by Pleistocene glacial deposits from long after the Mesozoic. There had to be somewhere in North America with the most Mesozoic strata. It being in the west and southwest isn't evidence for a flood.
How do you get that without something like catastrophic plate tectonics?
170 million years of geology and biology, that's how. It's not a kill zone. It's just a place where for tens of millions of years dinosaurs lived and died. You can tell because the rocks aren't actually flood deposits, and because, even if they were, we already know that Dan's flood model is physically impossible for many reasons, so the flood rocks would have had to have formed over the course of millions of years anyway.
So here's where the biggest T-Rex was found. Look at all those layers underneath that helicopter.
Something floods don't tend to do. They tend to deposit a single graduated turbidite deposit. So that's a problem for the flood.
Evolutionists say that, maybe it was a Chicxulub asteroid that fell, 2,500 miles away.
Nope, and no one says that. The asteroid couldn't have formed any of those deposits except for the topmost Cretaceous deposits, and we have very few rocks that can be attributed to that event. Although, not none. Essentially, none of these fossils is explained in reference to the asteroid impact. In fact, most of them couldn't be, because they were already dead and buried tens of millions of years before the asteroid.
Well, if we drop the rock and drop that Yucatan Peninsula asteroid, the Chicxulub asteroid right there, you've got a little bit of flooding that's going to come up to Texas and Florida and bring tsunamis up maybe 10 feet high, 15 feet high. It's going to cover some parts of the southern states, but you're going to miss the dinosaur kill zone.
Yeah, you will. Although I'd point out that the asteroid hit at the end of the Cretaceous, when much of the area that he calls a kill zone was actually connected to the Gulf of Mexico as part of the Western Interior Seaway, because sea levels were much higher. So in fact, a tsunami would hit most of that area, but even so, it wouldn't cause most of those fossils. Dan is arguing against something no one has ever believed, at least no one in the field.
The evidence shows we have 1 million square cubic miles.
I hate cubic miles. It's such a stupid unit. My advice is to ignore anyone who wants to measure things in cubic miles.
Square miles in the middle of America here.
I'm not a fan of square miles either, but whatever, it's fine.
Covering 14 states, it's nowhere near where the Chicxulub asteroid landed.
Sure isn't, but So what? What do you think Dan would say if I told him that Christianity was wrong because Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem? But that's really far away from Cincinnati. He'd probably say, so what? And yeah, he should. And that's what you should say if anyone ever tries to tell you that science is wrong because a fossil is far away from the Yucatan. It's completely meaningless.
So these creatures were killed way, way up there through these cycling tsunamis that were happening when the seafloor is subducting, and we've got the tsunamis coming up from the left to the right. They're coming up from California and washing over Oklahoma, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana.
Then why are they found mostly in things like tufaceous sandstone, siltstone, sandstone, much of which is shallow marine, lacustrine, fluvial, or alluvial, which, isn't flood rock or tsunami rock? There is no reason to think that either a global flood or a single asteroid impact is responsible for all these fossils. No one thing is responsible for all these fossils.
Those whole regions, and it's happening because of catastrophic rifting, catastrophic plate tectonics.
Except that while I'll grant that catastrophic plate tectonics might cause earthquakes, it can't cause tsunamis because there would be no ocean left. We already did the math on that. It's like trying to make a wave pool inside of a forge used to make steel. You physically can't do it. Sure, the vibrations needed are easy, but water physically cannot exist in there as a liquid, so it would be on the whole of Earth if Dan were right.
Something's happening that's bringing the ocean waters up from the west and bringing it up east. And
even if we ignore the catastrophic plate tectonics can't possibly make tsunamis, or even happen while there's a flood at the same time, as they're mutually exclusive, it would also be causing the Rockies to rise. They themselves would block tsunamis, limiting their impact further inland. And that remains true even if the tsunamis are higher than the Rockies. Now, a tsunami taller than the mountains wouldn't be entirely stopped by the mountains, but it would still reduce the energy and volume of the water that could cross over the mountain. Has Dan done any analysis to this to see how much the rise of the Rockies would be affecting the tsunamis and vice versa? It seems like it would be a really important aspect of the model building.
Spreading it all over these states in America in order to create that 1,000 square mile kill zone that's 1,800 miles long, 1,000 miles wide. Something else is happening besides an asteroid falling down in Mexico, thousands of miles south from this location.
Right, almost 200 million years of time. That's what's happening.
So the other big key giveaway, and this is a little bit harder to explain, hopefully I'll do a good job with it, but remember how I mentioned the leading proof for Noah's flood in my mind, the most obvious proof, is that these creatures are buried in three products: ash, mud, and sand.
And silt and clay and so on and so forth. But yeah, sedimentary rocks are made out of sediments, which is all he's really saying. This isn't a surprise, this isn't evidence of a flood. It's just that that's how sedimentation works. Whether there's a global flood or not. Like, what are the other options? Dinosaur fossils found in layers of cotton fabric? Layers of dry ice? Layers of hydrogen plasma? No, obviously not. Both the flood and science predict that there should be a lot of sedimentary rocks out there, and that it should have fossils. You can't use that on its own to argue for one or the other. You have to use much more specific predictions for both.
Those three things, nothing more, nothing less.
Except for all the other things they are in fact buried in.
Go in the middle of Utah, you start digging up dinosaurs. Most of them are, like, for example, the Brushy Basin member,
which is part of the Jurassic Morrison Formation, where I'm from. It's made of interbedded conglomerate and mudstone that has various levels of ash, making it tufaceous, but not actually tough. Also, the Morrison Formation contains siltstone and limestone. Things Dan thinks aren't there, because he thinks only mud, ash, and sand contain fossils. He's just wrong about that, though.
Which is a huge strata of ash. It's just megatons of ash.
There is a lot of ash, but calling it a layer of ash is just incorrect. In some places in the Brushy Basin member, the level of ash rises to 50%, but it is significantly less in most locations. Most of the sediment in the Brushy Basin is not ash.
You'll go some places and find dinosaurs just buried in ash.
Not the Morrison Formation, though, including the Brushy Basin member.
In other cases, it's mud, sand, and ash.
Yes, like in his only cited example.
But it's safe to say that a lot of the dinosaurs in America are buried in those three things. So
Get on with it.
Yes, get on with it!
Get on with it.
how do you get ash and mix it up with mud and sand and bury millions of dinosaurs?
Volcanoes. Volcanoes push ash into the air. Ash fall. If it falls in a place that doesn't otherwise have any ongoing sedimentation, it can turn into tuff. If it falls in a place where there is ongoing sedimentation, then that ash will be added to the sediment and you'll get a tuffaceous rock that's a mix of ash and whatever else was being deposited. Floods are in no way required for this, only volcanoes. Heck, you don't even need water. If the ash falls in a place where there is wind-borne sand, it can form a tuffaceous subaerial sandstone. Further, let's not forget that most of the tuff in North America is subaerial tuff. That means it fell onto dry land, not into floodwaters. Once again, we see the reasons that Dan wants us to believe in the flood are actually good reasons to reject the flood. It's like there's a theme here.
Well, it takes something like catastrophic plate tectonics.
No, it doesn't, and we can tell because volcanoes still erupt today, depositing ash in various places, including in things like lakes, rivers, and seas that are depositing sediment right now. The Creationist favorite volcano, Mount St. Helens, did that. If you do a sample of the sediment at the bottom of Spirit Lake at the foot of the volcano, you will find an ashy deposit there. You might notice that while there was a volcanic eruption of the mountain in 1980, plate tectonics wasn't in overdrive, and the continents weren't moving at nearly a kilometer per hour. More like 3 centimeters per year. The idea that you can't get tuff or tuffaceous sedimentary rock without catastrophic plate tectonics is contradictory to the Creationist claims about Mount St. Helens.
So you have subducting plates are causing subduction-related volcanism on the sides of the continents, blowing up all this ash. Here, for example, we have the Independence Dyke Swarm. It's a 375-mile linear rift zone in the Los Angeles region. Here's an overlay of it.
All of that remains true without putting the rate of tectonic activity at about 4 billion times faster than what it's ever been known to be, which is what catastrophic plate tectonics is. It's an error of 7 orders of magnitude, which I guess is pretty typical for creationists.
Evolutionists admit that that Independence Dyke Swarm blew out 4,000 cubic miles of ash.
What does he mean by admit? Who has ever thought that was a problem? Volcanic activity puts ash into the air. This isn't something that is a problem for evolution. What is he talking about? If you understand the argument he's trying to make, put it in the comments.
And look, here's the Brushy Basin member of ash, and we can fly that in looking over Utah and Colorado. Look where all that ash is and where it came from.
Yup, the Independence Dyke Swarm is a series of intrusive igneous features that formed in the Jurassic and throughout much of the late Jurassic spewed ash into the air from time to time, resulting in much of the sediment deposited at the time being mixed with ash. This is in fact why the Brushy Basin member is characterized by significant amounts of ash, even though usually less than half of the sediment is ash. It's even true that this is caused by subduction of the Pacific plate under the North American plate, even though earlier Dan seemed to say that the subduction should be happening on the same side of the continent as the seafloor is spreading, and this is the opposite side.
How do you fill parts of several states with ash layers if you don't have rapid subduction that's causing the rifting and the volcanism from Southern California?
Normal subduction. You see, the crust that's subducting under the North American plate brings with it sediment and water, no matter how fast it's subducting. This material has a much lower melting temperature than the rocks of the mantle, and so it forms pools of liquid hot magma under the North American plate. These build up pressure and seek out any structural weakness in the rock above, flowing up to relieve the pressure. When enough pressure builds up, it can break through the rock, causing an eruption. This will spew ash into the air, often many kilometers up into the air. The ash is carried by the prevailing winds to other locations, where it eventually will fall out of the air.
When I was a teenager and the Mount St. Helens blew up, that quote little volcanic system, it burped out enough ash to cover 3 states and darken the skies for 3 days.
Yes, and it didn't require catastrophic plate tectonics. I don't know if Dan knows this, but the year of our Lord 1980 is a bit after when he thinks the flood happened.
And that only put out 1/4 of 1 cubic mile of ash. So Mount St. Helens covers 3 states with ash for 3 days, can't even see the sun. The Independence Dyke Swarm, during the flood, puts out 4,000 cubic miles of ash.
Dan is just begging the question. That's only an impressive number if you think it all had to happen in the space of a few months. It actually happened over the course of hundreds of thousands of years minimum. But science doesn't indicate that the Independence Dyke Swarm erupted one time and then shut off forever. Again, Dan is begging the question.
That's how you buried the dinosaurs, and the proof that they're buried in ash and mud and sand indicates that the mechanisms that produce those three products was happening concurrently.
Yes, as happens now. Rocks weather into sand particles, sediment gets mixed into the water, and volcanoes erupt all the time. It's not like this is a tabletop role-playing game where everyone needs to roll initiative to see whether the volcano or the river can go next. Does Dan think that outside of the flood, volcanoes pause wind and rain and the flow of rivers? Unless he does, I don't see how he can possibly think that this is a good argument. Okay, everyone. You all know the triangle meme that says that a creationist can be a well-informed, honest, and creationist at most too? Tell me whether you think Dan is well-informed and dishonest, or ill-informed but honest. Put it in the comments. Not just because it feeds the algorithm god, but also because I'm curious.
That's the number one takeaway I want you guys to have, is that the only way you can bury these dinosaurs over hundreds of thousands of square miles in those three products is you have to have mechanisms producing those three things at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. But just go outside and then note that sometimes volcanoes make the news. Boom, that's all the mechanisms you need, and they're all going on. Has Dan just never touched grass in his life? Is that what's going on? How does he not see that there are continuous mechanisms producing sediment right now, and that any ash that falls into them will be incorporated into any layers they form? How does anyone think this is compelling?
And the only thing that explains that, the only mechanism that's going to pull that off, is catastrophic plate tectonics.
That's weird, because I live in a world that pulls off simultaneous sedimentation and volcanism every single day, and yet that is not undergoing the ocean boiling nonsense of catastrophic plate tectonics.
That was happening during the flood.
Or that could have, if it wouldn't have turned the flood into a steam bath.
So here's an example of all of those, the ash-producing volcanics that have happened. We have Mount St. Helens is that little tiny block way off to the right, little quarter mile, quarter cubic mile of ash, and we have the Independence Dike Swarm.
Which isn't a single eruption, making this whole diagram very misleading. Dike swarms can erupt over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. So divide that volume by 100,000 and the daily ash output of the dike swarm is actually much lower than Mount St. Helens, whose eruption lasted only about 9 hours. You can't just compare the total volume of the volcanic output and then conclude that the eruptions release energy at a rate that's directly proportional to the volume of the debris. It's trivially easy to show that a lower rate of released material and energy over a longer time can result in more total energy and debris released into the environment, all without being part of the cause of a global catastrophe. Creationists really struggle to understand time, just like flat earthers struggle to understand three spatial dimensions.
Happening during the flood, blowing out 400,000 cubic miles of ash. That's why we have ash burying the dinosaurs, but they're buried with mud and sand. So it was happening concurrently at the same time.
As predicted by actual geology, which also has the advantage of not breaking any laws of physics, unlike catastrophic plate tectonics. Dan's inability to comprehend the world around him isn't evidence that his favorite interpretation of his favorite book is the real history of the world.
So there's Mount St. Helens, and when we dig up these dinosaurs and we really study dinosaur taphonomy, this is the three things that we find. We get mud that's coming in from the tsunamis that are coming in from the west to the east.
Well, no, because none of this is actually in tsunamite. It's in things like fluvial mudstone, which precludes a catastrophic origin for the mud, meaning that this is simply incorrect.
Sand is the ocean floor. That's all those products are being blown in as well from the catastrophic rifting that's happening.
Sand occurs all over the place, and in fact, much of the sandstone in the fossil record is actually aeolian. That means that it was made of fancy mayonnaise, or that it was deposited by the wind above the water.
And we have the ash that's happening from the subduction of the new seafloor that's diving underneath the land continents.
As opposed to the sea continents, I guess? But yeah, we don't need the tectonics to be catastrophic to get volcanoes, as evidenced by their existence and continuing activity to this very day. Indeed, as I sit here writing this, the Smithsonian is tracking 46 erupting volcanoes around the world.
So it's a trifecta of trifectas happening that's perfectly explained by seafloor subduction that had to be rapiding.
Remember, the only reason it has to be rapid is because without begging the question, this argument is obviously wrong. Dan has to rely on a logical fallacy to even give the appearance that he knows what he's talking about.
Happening rapidly because it's diving underneath the land continents, causing all that irritation, all the subduction. It's coming up, and that's what's generating all of the ash. And it's those three products we find the dinosaurs buried in.
No, it's not. In fact, his example of the brushy basin member of the Morrison Formation, isn't all ash and sand and mud. It's actually conglomerate and ash and mud.
So here's an example. Let's just take a look at the Morrison Formation.
The Morrison Formation is like my hometown.
That's a 600,000 square mile chunk of this million-mile kill zone.
One cool thing about the Morrison Formation is that it can be at least partially directly radiometrically dated. You see, the bushy basin member of the formation, which Dan has already mentioned, contains a significant amount of volcanic ash, allowing something that is normally impossible, the radiometric dating of a fossil-bearing sedimentary stratum. It's pretty cool, isn't it? Also, there is no kill zone. Dan just thinks that the fact that there's really only a few parts of North America with extensive Mesozoic sedimentary rock, it's somehow evidence for the flood? It doesn't make any sense at all, which is a theme for Dan.
So if you go into Morrison, Colorado, that's in the heart of Morrison, the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation is a Jurassic formation, so it's the early stages of the flood.
Wouldn't that be the middle stages of the late stages? If the flood starts in the Cambrian and ends at the end of the Cretaceous? I don't know where Dan thinks the flood ends in the geological record. You'd think it would be blindingly obvious, and yet there's disagreement about it within young Earth creationism. And he keeps using these geological terms for rock systems like Jurassic, when Kent has many times said they are meaningless because there is no geological column.
Layers then were assigned an age and a name and an index fossil. Now this is very important. This was all done during the early 1800s. This geologic column is the Bible for the evolutionist. It can only be found one place in the world. The only place you can find the geologic column is in the textbooks. In the textbooks, they talk about, here's an earth science textbook, about how, during the Cenozoic and Mesozoic and Paleozoic era, they've got it all figured out like, wow, this is, millions of years old, and it's just simple baloney.
And we have this Morrison Formation, and this, again, here we go. It's going to be hard to explain.
Harder than geology in general? I doubt that.
It's a 300-foot thick mud pancake.
I don't know if I've ever heard a worse description of a geological formation than mud pancake. Mudstone is a common component of the Morrison Formation, but it also contains conglomerate, siltstone, limestone, and sandstone. Further, I have no idea what makes it a pancake. It's not round, it wasn't made in a pan, and it's not cake. And I don't recommend eating it, no matter how much syrup you put on it. Although Google did once tell me that doctors recommend eating one small rock a day. So I don't know, nothing is real anymore. Nothing apart from this video, that is.
That spans 13 states.
Normally, I don't think of 13 as a particularly big number, but here I think it counts as big number, therefore God. I don't know, you keep your own creationist bingo card. It's not like there are real rules for prizes.
So let's just stop right there. How do you pull that off? How do you take mud
and silt, lime, sand, and clay? Let's not forget those.
And make a 300-foot thick layer of it and swath it over 13 states.
You don't. That's not what the Morrison Formation is. The Morrison Formation isn't a single deposition across the whole area. We can tell because a single depositional event tends to leave behind a single layer of a particular kind of rock. But the Morrison Formation is a complex set of various rocks, sometimes interbedded, that vary in composition and time of deposition. What unites it is first, that humans are a bit arbitrary, and second, that it represents a mostly continuous and geographically isolated segment of the Jurassic period. Also, it's significant because of the high number of fossil finds there. Science is not faced with the problem of explaining the Morrison Formation via a single mechanism. There is no single mechanism of any specificity beyond sedimentation, compaction, and cementing that can explain the whole thing. A flood is physically impossible as the mechanism for creating the formation, as things like limestone simply are not deposited in floods. The formation is made of things like lakes, floodplains, rivers, etc., all of which are just doing normal geology stuff for about 10 million years. That's more than enough time for the up to 200 meters of Morrison Formation to deposit over a wide area.
Again, it screams worldwide flood.
Which part is it that screams worldwide flood? Is it the shale and limestone that couldn't have been deposited in a flood? Tsunami or no?
So it's 300 feet thick. It probably started out much thicker.
That's true.
This is in fact how sedimentary rock works. It must compactify, which usually involves squeezing out water in order to be closely packed enough that it can cement. This usually reduces the height of any given column of sediment anywhere from 60 to 80%.
But if we fly down a Boeing 747, just for size comparison, that's only 230 feet long.
Anything that's over 230 feet in any dimension will exceed in that dimension the length of a Boeing 737. That's how length works. Football fields are also longer than 737s. Most three-story buildings are taller than a Boeing 737 is long.
I don't know why this information is here. Do Dan and Ken's audiences normally have trouble comparing numbers to see which is bigger?
We can just by comparison, like, okay, well, this is over 330 square feet thick. Actually started out at over 600 feet thick, but it's been compacted over time.
Actually, I think that's a pretty big underestimate. I think a much more reasonable estimate is up to 1,600 feet thick. I'm not sure if any of that matters, though.
Empire State Building, 1,470 feet. And we know, and here's the key, did you know that every known Jurassic dinosaur species in America is found in that single layer?
Well, first, it's not a single layer. You can tell because it's composed of members, which themselves are composed of units. So calling it a single layer is just wrong. Also, it's just not true that all known North American Jurassic dinosaurs are from the Morrison Formation. Numerous Jurassic footprints have been found in Massachusetts and Connecticut. There are also Jurassic ichnofossils from Nova Scotia, Nuevo Leon, Puebla, Oaxaca, and the DC metro area. Granted, these aren't body fossils, but ichnofossils are fossils, and ichnogenera are real genera. If Dan wanted to say that all known Jurassic body fossils of dinosaurs are from the Morrison Formation, then he'd be right. And of course, my source for that is simply the same as his source, PaleoDB.
Over 50 species of dinosaurs buried together family style.
What the does that mean? They were all sharing one big bucket of fries? This is a geological formation, not a goddamn Italian restaurant where you get a whole lasagna to feed 5 people.
Over 13 states in a 300-foot thick mud pancake.
Over the course of 10 million years, give or take about a million years. Seems pretty reasonable to me.
Who in their right mind is going to believe that an asteroid pulled that off?
No one. The last parts of the Morrison Formation were deposited some 80 million years before the start of the Cretaceous. We are currently closer to the last Tyrannosaurus rex in time than T-Rex was to the deposition of any part of the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation has absolutely nothing to do with the Chicxulub impact. It's like asking how George Washington could have won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, or wondering why Genghis Khan didn't conquer ancient Sumeria. Dan is seemingly incapable of understanding that time exists and that events happen in a sequence.
You have to be blind to not see it was a worldwide flood.
You know, false dichotomies are always bad, but when one of the two options isn't even the thing your opponents or anyone else thinks is true, it's especially bad. Either I'm right or this obvious strawman that no one has ever held is right. Which one? Yeah, not a good argument. Watch, I can do it too. You see, either you have to accept Wicca as the one true religion, or you have to believe, as the Christians do, that in fact celery is a tool of Satan created to increase the lust of Christian women so that they fornicate with the heathens. I feel like Dan would not find that argument a compelling argument against Christianity. For the same reason, either you accept a worldwide flood as the cause of all dinosaur fossils, or you accept a single asteroid impact as the cause of all dinosaur fossils, is not a compelling argument against science.
That's the only way you're going to bury every known species of dinosaurs in the Jurassic layers over a 13-state region, 600,000 square miles, 300 feet thick of mud.
Maybe if you, for some reason, require them to all be buried in one event, but that's not what happened. Really, this whole argument is defeated by just pointing out that there's not a great ontological necessity to the idea that all dinosaurs were buried in one event.
And they're still digging up dinosaurs from that area today. So
that's true.
Here's all the fossil occurrences, all the different genera,
not genre.
You know, hundreds of different species of plants and animals, and that's just what we found so far.
Yep, such a large area is likely to have had even more plants and animals than have been found.
So now let's close down with a few more evidences.
I actually get asked pretty frequently about the word evidences. Typically the word evidence is not a countable noun in English, and so cannot be pluralized. And if it needs to be quantified, it needs a counting word, usually piece, such as 4 pieces of evidence. However, even as late as the late 19th century, use of evidence as a count noun was actually pretty common throughout the English language. It persists today almost entirely in Christian theology and apologetics, but it is not something new that they are doing. It's just that they are keeping an older use of the word, when the usage of the word changed in most of society. Is it wrong to use evidence this way? Well, it is not standard, and most editors outside of the world of Christian publishing would ask for a correction. But in terms of language use, the idea of right or wrong is kind of weird. Further, even if it were an unambiguous error to use the word evidences, which I contend it is not, it doesn't really matter to the argument anyone is making, and so it's not really worth my time to correct it each time. Indeed, I'm not even really correcting it here, but rather explaining why I don't really need to, as well as why the word is even used by people like Dan Biddle and Kent Hovind.
As we go through, I think this is one of my leading evidences that personally convinced me.
Ah yes, the alleged Triceratops horn discovered by Mark Armitage and the late Kevin Anderson. Here's the thing, we don't know what that is, but we'll get into it more soon.
This is a dinosaur Triceratops horn that was discovered by Mark Armitage, and when you demineralize it and put it under a microscope and take a couple of forceps, you can still pull and stretch this dinosaur bone.
First, you can't stretch bone like that. Bone is hydroxyapatite. It is brittle and non-elastic biomineral. Second, we don't know what's being stretched there because we don't actually know what Mark found. He found a horn in a place that is known to have Maastrichtian Cretaceous dinosaurs, including Triceratops, but there's a complication. The area also has Pleistocene alluvium, that is, debris that was washed into channels. About 20 miles away, an extinct bison fossil was found in an area that has about the same geology as the Beisch Ranch where Armitage found his horn. He also did not make a site map, gather sufficient in-situ photographs of the horn. He did not do a cladistic analysis to show that his identification of the horn as Triceratops horridus was accurate. He did not characterize the matrix the horn was found in, and his location data was an obscure system used to divide parcels of land up for tax purposes as opposed to the GPS coordinates which are now standard, and which resulted in a huge multi-acre area. I've since worked with friend of the channel Dr. Dino, no relation, to see if he can pinpoint the location of the find, and we found that it was indeed in an area where Pleistocene alluvium is possible. So we have no way to conclude that this is not a bison latifrons horn. Further, in what few pictures we have of the horn, there is visible plant contamination, which means there is likely much other contamination, meaning that even if the horn is an actual Triceratops horn, there's no way to know if much of what Armitage has uncovered is actually contamination from modern organisms, or if it was actually intrinsic to the animal whose horn this was. In other words, because Mark Armitage doesn't know the first thing about paleontology, he ruined any ability for science to actually examine his work and either validate it or falsify it. Now, do I think it's a Triceratops horn? I honestly don't know. Talking to Shauna, one of the owners of the ranch, has made me less skeptical of the Triceratops claim, but I certainly do not believe it. I remain agnostic on the question.
So it was a horn, you demineralize it, and it's still got stretchy, soft materials to it.
As far as the demineralize and you get stretchy stuff, yes, that can be done with some dinosaur bones, and it seems to have been done with whatever it was that Mark found.
I dug into this field hard. I spent weeks in this field. I did demineralization work myself. I had a dinosaur demineralization lab. I donated to ICR.
I don't believe him except about the ICR donation. I really doubt that Dan Biddle, PhD in communication, who thinks that the scientific explanation for all dinosaur fossils everywhere is the Chicxulub impactor, actually did any real experiments on real dinosaur fossils. At most, I think he may have visited Armitage's lab and pressed a few buttons at Armitage's direction, and that he also probably read some stuff from other creationists about soft tissues and fossils.
I'm 100% convinced that these dinosaurs are young.
Okay, but Dan is someone who believes that scientists think that the Morrison Formation was created by an asteroid that wouldn't hit Earth for some 80 million years after the formation was done being deposited. So his believing something, if anything, should give you pause, and reason to think that that thing is false. Not reason to think that it's true.
Because it's not just one different type of soft tissue product that we're finding in these dinosaur bones. Like here we might be seeing collagen and keratin as it's still stretchable and pliable. It used to be 14 different types of bioorganics that we're finding in dinosaur bones. Now we're up to 16.
I'm not sure what the argument is. If only 7 biomolecular fossils had been found in dinosaurs, would that make them old? But now that it's over a dozen, they're young? The preservation mechanism could work on many or few biomolecules. What matters is whether or not there is a plausible preservation mechanism to allow biomolecules to last for the purported period of time. If there is such a mechanism, then it could be applicable to thousands of biomolecules. That wouldn't make the preservation any more or less plausible.
16 different flavors of dinosaur products.
16 flavors, eh? Well, Dr. Pepper has 23 flavors, so I think I'll start worshipping the good Dr. Pepper. He is the bringer of carbonation, after all. I'll also renounce Mr. Pibb and all of his works.
That are left over by the flood, that are soft, that evolutionists say should all be gone by now, but it's not, so they're really stuck.
Evolutionists, huh?
Let us pray. Our Darwin, who art in the British Museum, hallowed be thy name. Thy evolution come, thy selection be done, on land as it is in water. Give us this day our daily sexual selection as we sexually select, and lead us not into inbreeding, but deliver us from extinction. Amen.
Except that they don't say they shouldn't exist. They obviously do exist, and reality is the final arbiter of what should exist scientifically speaking. Now, at first, scientists were extremely skeptical of the idea that these biomolecules were really from the dinosaurs because there was no known mechanism by which they could survive, and contamination is always a concern in laboratory settings. Since then, some mechanisms that are at least plausible have been found, such as iron cross-linking. But even if we had not yet found such a mechanism, the choices before us are that we abandon virtually everything we know about biology, geology, nuclear physics, chemistry, etc., and then decide that some bits of biomolecules are young, or we assume that there's some chemistry we aren't aware of. Obviously, the first option is what scientists went with. Dan would apparently prefer that anytime anything unexpected happens in the world of science, that we just start over completely.
Here's a picture of all the 16 different types of bioorganic soft tissues that they're finding.
I noticed that at least 3 of these just look like rocks or regular body fossils. And also, who uses pictures of these things without labels? What good is that?
And it's not just me, it's not Creationist saying it. We've compiled, actually Dr. Brian Thomas from ICR compiled a spreadsheet of 120 peer-reviewed journal articles. These are not Creationist publications. They're from histology journals, from biology journals, from bone study journals that have established these 16 different types of bioorganics that are found in dinosaur bones.
Yeah, because it turns out that there isn't actually a big conspiracy to hide the data. It's just that the data don't actually support any of the distinctive contentions of young Earth creationism.
We're talking about things like keratin, red blood cells, histones, fex histones, collagen, blood cells, blood vessels, arteries. It's all there.
Well, it is and it isn't. Look, this is dinosaur skin. The scientific consensus is that it's tens of millions of years old. Skin is soft tissue and really can't survive for tens of millions of years. Yet, here it is. So, what's going on? Well, you're not actually looking at skin, you're looking at a fossil in the shape of skin. The skin itself didn't survive intact for millions of years. It turned into something very stable, and that stable thing lasted for tens of millions of years. But that's also the case with these other instances of preserved soft tissue. For instance, intact collagen hasn't been found. Degraded and cross-linked collagen has been found. Hemoglobin hasn't been found. Stable porphyrins that are derived from heme groups have been found, and they likely originated in hemoglobin. So in one sense, Dan is right that these soft tissues can't last millions of years. He's just wrong that they need to.
And these dinosaur bones that are supposedly millions of years old, the last 2 that they discovered are dinosaur cartilage. And that's not an impression of cartilage, that's the real cartilage.
So this is, near as I can tell, based on the 2020 paper, Evidence of Proteins, Chromosomes, and Chemical Markers on DNA in Exceptionally Preserved Dinosaur Cartilage by Alida M. Balliol et al., published in the April issue of the National Science Review. While normally I would caution against quoting the first line of the abstract, in this case it's rather important. The first sentence of this paper is, a histological ground section from a duck-billed dinosaur nestling, Hyparchosaurus sedimentary, revealed microstructures morphologically consistent with nuclei and chromosomes in cells within calcified cartilage. So, was cartilage found? Well, cartilage is made of water, collagen, peptoglycans, and a few other proteins here and there. So it's not really made of calcium. So no, this isn't cartilage. In the same way that the skin I showed earlier isn't really skin. Calcium-rich minerals can last indefinitely, and so there's no reason to suspect that this bone is young because fossilized cartilage was found. Now, the idea of chromosomes being detectable is certainly interesting, although I remain skeptical, but hey, it'd be super cool if a chromosome was found.
And then the last thing that they just found is nerve cells.
The picture shown is figure 10 from the Mark Armitage paper, First Report of Peripheral Nerves in Bone of Triceratops horridus, Occipital Condyle, published in Microscopy Today, March 1st, 2021. I've already talked about the problems with Armitage's work. This is meaningless, because Mark didn't do the bare minimum needed for his work to even be used as evidence in paleontology. This paper means as much to science as Mark reporting on how it feels when he puts his thumb up his ass and wiggles it around.
Actual nerve fibers, not permineralized impressions of it, but real dinosaur nerves, thanks to Mark Armitage and his team.
Which would be really cool, if Mark had bothered to actually document his find so that it could be verified. He didn't. And even my personal attempts to do so have simply come up with, we can't rule out bison, and we've been given no reason to think that it's Triceratops, besides that it was found near a place where Triceratops have been found, which isn't enough.
That's the 16th thing that they just found.
Well, since that doesn't count, I guess we're down to 15.
So how do you preserve dinosaur nerves for millions of years? You can't. These things are young.
Well, you could preserve them in the same way you preserve other things, letting them decay into a stable chemical system that retains the overall shape of the nerves. But there's also no reason to think that there are preserved nerves to explain. I believe Mark found nerves, but that's the thing. He found nerves in a bone of unknown origin from an unknown animal of an unknown age, and in which at least some modern biological contamination is seen in Mark's own pictures of the bone in question.
Here's a list of 120 different peer-reviewed science journals that have substantiated that they are in fact finding soft tissues from dinosaurs that span literally the entire Mesozoic.
Okay, so what?
So are these dinosaurs soft tissues really 65 million years old and older?
No, in most cases they're older. Only non-avian dinosaurs from the end of the Cretaceous would be that old. And really, it would be 66 million years old. Most dinosaurs aren't from the end of the Cretaceous. Non-avian dinosaurs lived on Earth for some 160 plus million years. Very few of them were around for just the end of the Cretaceous.
Or are they only about 4,400 years to 4,500 years old?
No, that is physically impossible for more reasons than I can even count.
I think the evidence shows that there really are younger.
Yeah, but Dan is also a idiot who thinks that the scientific consensus is that all dinosaurs who ever lived or died did so in the same year. Dan's assessment of the evidence is as reliable as a dead carp's assessment of the evidence.
So let's take the last few minutes here and jump into dinosaur lifespans.
Last few minutes? We're not even halfway done this episode. He still has like 15 minutes left.
But before we do that, I want to comment on one of the bioorganic soft tissues,
which is something he could have done before, saying he was going to move on.
And that's collagen. So bone is made up of bone mineral and collagen. Human bones are that way. Animal bones are that way.
Yes, because human bones are a subset of animal bones. Because humans are animals. It's amazing that creationists will readily admit things like that humans are vertebrates or mammals, but then pretend that they're not animals, even though vertebrata and mammalia are groups of animals. It's like saying that the Boston Red Sox are a baseball team, but then saying that they're not a sports team, even though baseball is a sport. Humans can't be mammals and not animals. That's not how it works. You can still believe in human exceptionalism and accept the very obvious fact that humans are animals.
It's an infusion of those two things. Bone minerals provide the hard enamel-like structure, and collagen provides the soft, pliable fibers and flexibility in bones. That's why we don't break our bones so easily when you fall down. It's got some soft, flexible stuff, and they're provided by the collagen.
That's true.
So collagen has a known decay rate. Scientists have been studying the decay rate of collagen for years.
Of course, there's a problem with that. Really more than one problem, but I'll focus on one of them here. The rates at which chemical reactions occur are highly contingent on things like pressure and temperature, unlike the rates at which spontaneous nuclear reactions occur, which are essentially unaffected by anything like pressure or temperature. So no matter what rate is quoted in the text, it will be contingent on the conditions of the experiment, which may or may not be met in the environment of any given fossil. Creationists love to take things like the decay rate of a protein, or the rate of change in the strength of the dipole moment of Earth's magnetosphere, or the recession rate of the moon from Earth, things that we know are not constant and can change, and then extrapolate them infinitely back in time as if they were constants in order to create reductio ad absurdum arguments against science. While simultaneously they'll take things that we can't seem to vary, like the maximum deposition rate for limestone, or the rate at which nuclei spontaneously decay, and then pretend that maybe physics was just different in order to avoid the obvious implications of those processes that show their own ideas to be absurd ones.
Many scientists put it in the 10,000 to 30,000 year mark.
I wonder if Dan has a citation for that. I mean, if it's most scientists who would say that, then surely he got that idea somewhere and he could tell us where. Odd that he doesn't. But, as I said, I don't much care what the estimated shelf life of collagen is under normal conditions. And of course, there's the problem that collagen hasn't been found in dinosaurs, at least not in the sense of intact collagen that hasn't decayed at all.
We're not talking about half-life, we're talking about maximum shelf life. So most scientists will come out and say, yeah, I think if you take a cow bone, throw it out in the mud, cover it up, after 10,000 years
It's time to conquer Earth!
or so, the collagen's just going to be gone. It's got a half-life, it's going to start chipping away, and it's just going to be gone. Some scientists will stretch it out to maybe 30,000 years. Other people have said 100,000 years, and there's a study that came out by Buckley and others that said, well, we're going to really get scientific about this and really push it and say, we think that collagen can last between 300,000 years to 900,000 years.
None of which is contradictory to finding collagen remnants in dinosaur bones far older, because the collagen didn't last. The whole argument is predicated on the idea that these soft tissue finds are of intact proteins that are essentially identical to the proteins that the animal had in life. But that's simply not what's being found. And that's on top of the fact that chemistry is context dependent. So just coming up with a particular shelf life for collagen that's broadly applicable doesn't really mean it's applicable under all contexts.
That's the official position of evolutionists.
Let us pray. Our Darwin, who art in the British Museum, hallowed be thy name. Thy evolution come. Thy selection be done, on land as it is in water. Give us this day our daily sexual selection, as we sexually select, and lead us not into inbreeding, but deliver us from extinction. Amen.
You might or might not be surprised to learn that there is no such thing as an official position of evolutionists. First, evolutionist is a weird word, but second, science doesn't operate by official proclamations from prophets, imams, popes, sheikhs, or synods of bishops. There are no required beliefs or prohibited beliefs. You can't actually be a scientific heretic. Now, I know what you're wondering. How then can I call people like young Earth creationists, Alan Fiducia, anti-vaxxers, flat earthers, or electric universe types non-scientists? Well, while science doesn't have dogmas handed down from on high from official positions, what it does have is a scientific method and the need to provide evidence for claims. Now, the scientific method is actually a collection of variations on the theme of empiricism, and different branches of science do not all conduct themselves in exactly the same way. For example, there are a few laboratory experiments in astronomy, whereas in particle physics we really only advance one lab experiment at a time. But the key is empiricism. We get data about the world, we come up with ideas about how those data relate to each other, and we test those ideas by making predictions about future data. Then, getting those data and seeing if they match the prediction within a margin of error. Importantly, you don't get to just discard relevant data. Now, it's true that no one person can reasonably have all the relevant data to hand and incorporate it into their experiment. But that's the importance of peer review and replication. If there is something a single worker or single team misses, others will likely bring what was missed to bear in the discussion, whether it be as notes from a peer review or a subsequent study. So what about those people whom I've mentioned as pseudoscientists? Well, they fundamentally do not care about data, ignore them when they're inconvenient, and do not accept corrections. For example, a real scientist, on learning that their hypothesis would require the physical properties of the Earth to change by several orders of magnitude and would have melted the planet, would abandon or at least heavily modify that hypothesis. Creationists just go with it anyway. Similarly, since there is simply no evidence that vaccines cause autism, anyone who says that they do did not get that belief as a result of scientific investigation, and anyone who keeps believing it after the lack of supporting evidence is pointed out is being anti-science. So science doesn't have official beliefs. It has beliefs that are supported by the currently available evidence, beliefs that are not, and therefore are not currently part of science, and ideas that there is evidence against, which, if held, put you squarely in the anti-science box. Creationism, as preached by Dan Biddle, is firmly in the anti-science box.
So, and then you can hear a pin drop after that, because you think, all right, that's all you're going to stretch collagen to, the maximum half-life, or the maximum shelf life, doesn't even reach 1 million years?
Yep, now where's that intact collagen? Because it's sure not in dinosaur bones. Okay, honestly, I'm tired of him just lying about soft tissues, or if I'm being charitable, having absolutely no understanding of what it means when someone says they found the remnants of proteins or even DNA. I'm going to skip ahead for my own sanity, and so you don't have to keep hearing me say over and over again that what was found wasn't actually an intact protein, and that those intact molecules did indeed decay. You get the point. Further repetition won't help.
So I was a testifying expert for about 20 years in state and federal court cases dealing with statistics and research.
Well, that's horrifying. Maybe anyone whose conviction was aided by this moron's so-called expertise could use his ramblings about this absolute nonsense on behalf of a convicted fraud as some kind of evidence that their conviction should be overturned, or at least that they should get a new trial.
And I I can't say I discovered this because I'm just recycling the research that was done by others on this topic, but I can say I took the raw data myself and pressure tested it as hard as I could, looking at what's called power law curves and polynomial regression.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it. Get on with it.
You guys, there is amazing ironclad proof that people used to live longer before the flood than they do now.
Ironclad proof, eh? This better be a lot better than some guy running a regression analysis on the ages of the people in the genealogies in Genesis.
Well, we also now know that it's a biological decay curve.
As opposed to what? Non-biological decay curves? You'll probably be interested to know that a search for that term brings up creationist genealogical nonsense in the first two results, and then just a bunch of math about decay curves. So no, a biological decay curve isn't really a thing.
And we only have one of two answers for it. Number one, it was based upon a concerted scam of the Bible authors over 3,000 years to systematically, through multiple generations, somehow slowly decline the lifespans of people from an average of 912 years before the flood to the years that we have now, and pass along this lie through multiple generations to make it slope down a nice gradual slope.
First, there's no reason to think that it has been a millennia-long conspiracy. Genesis wasn't written over the course of 1,000 years. It was written as a few different texts by at least 3 authors, possibly more, and compiled and redacted during the Babylonian exile. All that's needed to get consistent dates is for the redactor to want the ages to be consistent and grow as they go back in time. All this would take is some idea of fractions and multiplication. The Babylonians were mathematical pioneers, and any foreign scribe in Babylon would likely have been exposed to more than enough mathematics to be able to do things like multiply the ages of the patriarchs by some number between 1 and 2 to get an exponential age growth going back in time. And also, he could then just vary that age from the baseline for his own reasons. Really, this whole thing requires one guy who's okay at math during the Babylonian exile. It's not a super extraordinary thing. And I'm not saying this is definitely how the ages got to be where they are, just that if we want to take the root of the ages being just made up, we really don't need anything unusual or far-fetched to account for that idea.
Which is, of course, preposterous, because you can't do that for 3,000 years, carry on a multi-generational scam like that.
Well, there was no reason to keep it going for thousands of years over multiple generations. Just one guy doing it one time is enough.
Or the Genesis lifespans are real recorded lifespans, and something is causing humans to not go from 900 years lifespan before the flood and then all of a sudden drop down to 70, 80, 90 years. No, something caused them to fall down off of a slope.
I'd agree that this is at least a possibility that would explain the text. Of course, the bigger problem is that we know that the stories in the first bits of Genesis are bits of myth and legend that have from little to no historical or archaeological backing. And in the case of things like Genesis 1 through 11, basically none of it is historically true. So we can safely rule this option out until we have reason to even consider the possibility that these genealogies represent real ages of real people. Using these as evidence of the historicity of Genesis only makes sense if you start by accepting their historicity. That's classic question begging.
And it's called the biological decay curve. So let's take a look at this. We all know that people age. God built that in our gene code. Of course, it was related to the fall, but God knew that our lifespans were going to shrink, and especially shrink after the flood. So
that's a lot of assertions with no evidence, but whatever.
It looks like, after about 100 years, that's about all you're going to get, right? Well, how in the world are these people living so much longer before the flood? So if that's just what we got to see people age in 100 years, what about these guys that are living nearly 1,000 years?
Great question. It does seem like this is biologically impossible. And if you're arguing for something that seems biologically impossible, pointing out that the data fits a curve reasonably well doesn't really help. Also, this just feels like someone trying to argue that the Lord of the Rings is historical because of how realistic all the elven languages are. Using some internal consistency in a work of literature isn't evidence that that work of literature is historical. Conversely, though, it is the case that if a work of literature is inconsistent, that makes it less likely to be historical. The problem, of course, is that Genesis is internally consistent all over the place. The text can't even figure out who sold Joseph into slavery.
Average of the patriarchs before the flood was 912 years. And I just bring up this graphic to show you, we really have to think how long that is. 912 years, the average lifespan.
By saying 912 years, we're being told how long that is. What else is there to think about? We were given a number and a unit. That's all we need.
So before the flood, we have all this data from Scripture that shows, Adam's living 930, his son Seth 912 years, Methuselah is the guy that lasted the longest. He was 969. Noah was 950 years. But then if we go after the flood in Table 2, we see an interesting phenomenon that it doesn't just go from 900 and some years before the flood to just 80. It starts gradually declining, 600 years, 438, 433, 464. But it's not right all of a sudden. It's a very gradual, predictable slope that goes down all the way to where we have Abraham living 175 years old, and Moses, I think, was 120. So it starts sloping down.
I feel like this has to be the least rhetorically powerful argument for the history of Genesis that I've ever heard. Let me know if you think that there is any rhetorical value to this argument down in the comments. I really don't get it. Number goes down, therefore Genesis is history. I don't even get how that's supposed to work.
Well, when you statistically plot it all out, here's what it looks like. You've got the average lifespan of people before the flood, 912 years. You have the flood event, and then there's a curve. It starts sloping down 600 years, 500, 400, 300. It goes on down. They decrease exponentially.
But the decrease isn't actually exponential. It's just that you can fit a decay curve to it. You can also fit a line to it. If you use the ages from Noah to Abraham, you can get a line with a fit measured by r squared of 0.78864. Sure, a second order polynomial gives you a fit with an r squared of 0.8787, so slightly better, but not by that much. The problem really is that we only have a few data points. Really only 11. With 11 data points, you could fit all sorts of curves to the data. It doesn't really mean much. Any data will tend to have a curve or line of best fit, and that's not special. Does Dan have a control for this experiment? Like maybe the Sumerian king lists? Not that I can see. Well, let's try it. I'll use the kings Ubaru Tutu through Atab, that is the last antediluvian king, through the 10th post-diluvian king. The years in that case are 18,600, 1,200, 360, 670, 420, 300, 840, 960, 840, 900, and 600. Now look at that. Using the same regression, we get an even better fit with an r-squared value of 0.9056. Now I should note that the years here are regnal years, not ages of death, but I don't really see why that would matter. Also, I got the regnal periods from the Wikipedia page. So if the argument is that a decay curve with a close fit is evidence of historicity, then it seems like the Sumerian king list is a better source of historicity than the Bible. Of course, the problem for Dan is that if that's the case, then it's not his god who's responsible for the flood, it's the gods of ancient Mesopotamia. If Dan wants to reject this, then he'll have to abandon the idea that just having a good fit to a decay curve is evidence of historicity.
Well, who's going to figure this out? Dr. John Sanford figured it out. He's a Cornell-trained geneticist.
So he knows the importance of having a control, which means he should have also done the work to compare the biblical genealogy to similar things from the ancient Near East, like non-biblical king lists or genealogies, yet he didn't.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
Wrote a book called Genetic Entropy.
Well, it's Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, and I read that book, but it's been a minute. I don't remember anything in there about a regression analysis of a Genesis genealogy, but yeah, he does explain the shortening of lifespans by genetic entropy. Of course, as I've covered elsewhere, genetic entropy is mathematically impossible. It's barely even coherent. It's a nothing. I'm not going to get into it unless Dan does.
And as far as I'm concerned, he's proven using...
No, he hasn't. Generally, nothing in science is ever proven, but in this case, we can actually use the math of population genetics to prove 100% that his ideas simply cannot reflect what actually happens in populations, unless we're simply wrong about the very basics of genetics, like what a gene is, or about just how numbers like probability work at a fundamental level.
Good takes on modern science. That when you take when you create what's called a genetic bottleneck, and you take the however many people were living before the flood, there's lots of dates before, lots of debates about how many people were living before the flood. But when you take the genetic variety of people who were living before the flood and bottleneck them down to just 8 people, you've got Noah and his wife, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 3 wives, 8 people, put them on the ark. Something happens when they get off the ark and they start inbreeding. The mutations begin exponentially increasing.
You know what, Dan? You Trina Breed asshole. That's the dumbest shit I've heard since Uncooked Matthew told me that the Bible was written in pre-Yiddish and that the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't really read the New Testament. Inbreeding is definitionally when genetic diversity goes down in a population over generations and mutations increase in genetic diversity. They're opposites, and sand fraud knows that. Bottlenecks don't cause mutations, they reduce genetic diversity. Genetic entropy pretends that that's a good thing, because according to genetic entropy, the more mutations, the worse, which is identical to saying the more genetic diversity, the worse is for a population. Of course, that's dumb as anyone involved in conservation will tell you. The lower genetic diversity of a population is, the worse it is for the survival of the population. This whole thing is just dumb as shit, and I'm tired of creationists pretending that there's anything to this. They can fuck off with that, those dumb.
And as the mutations in our gene pool began exponentially increasing,
which they didn't, mutations don't increase exponentially. It's pretty linear. We can measure this in the real world. Also, how does this connect to the mathematical fit of a polynomial regression to the ages in a genealogy?
Our lifespans begin exponentially decreasing.
So let me get this right. If you get everything about population genetics wrong, then it can explain an unremarkable statistical result from doing analysis on a genealogy we've already known can't be true. And therefore, maybe the book the genealogy is from is historically accurate afterwards, even though that's mathematically and physically impossible. Cool. That's a very normal and not weird at all line of reasoning.
The two things are related. Mutations are sloping up, and lifespans are sloping down.
This is when Dapper realized that all of his life choices had been wrong.
They're related to this phenomenon known as a bottleneck event. So you've got your original population, you shake just 8 marbles into the jar, the surviving population begins breeding, and then you've got the new population.
I like how in his on-screen graphic we're supposed to see the color of the marbles as different genotypes, and how at the end the exact same colors are there as at the beginning, just in different proportions. It's almost like this graphic isn't illustrating his pretended increase in mutations after the bottleneck, which means it probably wasn't an image pulled from a creationist source, but rather, I'm guessing, a textbook made by a non-conspiracy theorist pseudoscientist.
When you do that, and humans are inbreeding, you're going to have exponentially increasing mutations.
Weird, because that's not what actual population geneticists think. I wonder where Dan got that. Oh, right, John Sanford. The guy who likes to lie to his audience about both basic genetics and things like what language the origin of species was written in. Like, really, this is akin to saying that the more ice you put in your water, the hotter it gets.
And of course, this is a post-fall world, so they're going to be living, shorter lifespans. Also, we also know that the pre-flood world was more conducive and designed for longer lifespans.
Ah yes, the pre-flood world with virtually no oxygen that had no plant life, since we don't even have fossil pollen in the rocks Dan thinks are pre-flood. You know, if Dan thinks that those are the conditions that are most conducive to long life, I encourage him to go hang in a sealed container with no food and barely any oxygen and see how long he lasts. It'll be a cool experiment in antediluvian longevity whose results can be replicated by all the professional young Earth creationists.
The Earth we're in today, lots of different factors that could also contribute to decreasing lifespans.
Such as?
But after looking into this, I really think it was something in our gene pool mostly that was driving the decreasing lifespans.
Interesting. Kent seems to think it's because of X-rays.
How many have ever had an X-ray before? I broke 9 bones growing up. When you break something, you go to the hospital and they'll say, okay, take off all your clothes and put this little gown on. You say, well, is this machine dangerous? He says, no, it's harmless. You say, how does this work, doc? He says, well, when I mash the button, little X-ray bullets come out of that machine, and they're going to go right through your carcass, just like a machine gun, and they're going to blast a bunch of little holes in you, but you can't feel them. They're real tiny. They go right through, except the bone stops them, and it's going to make a reverse image of what's inside your body. But see, the holes heal up real fast, so you don't even feel them. But folks, did you know the sun X-rays you all day long? Except on cloudy days. Other than cloudy days when water stops the X-rays, you get X-rayed every day of your life. And your poor skin feels the full force of these X-rays. Your skin gets blasted full of holes, and your body has to fix all the holes. No problem. But after 40 or 50 or 60 years, your skin starts to lose the war, and it cannot keep up with the damage, and your skin begins to wrinkle up. But before the flood, that didn't happen. The Bible says before the flood came, the people lived to be more than 900 years old.
So here's what happens when we plot it all out. We throw up the data points, we plot it down, and lo and behold, again, as a statistician, I'm jumping up and down right now going, you can't make this stuff up. And I really mean it. You can't make this stuff up.
I mean, either you can, or the Sumerians did it better, because their fit is better at least on some regressions. I'm not going to take the time to do all of them. Also, I noticed that he's using data points that are not the same as the ones in the previous graph of ages from genealogies, but whatever. But also, you can't just use p-values as a naive indication of the chance of something being due to random noise. It's related to that, but the American Statistical Association notes that it's not so simple. Plus, even taken the naive way Dan takes it, this very low p-value isn't the chance that the data is real, it's the chance that it's not completely random. But we wouldn't expect it to be random. It was written by people for a reason, and they had a reason for including the ages at all, and for having them decline. The only reason he can say that this is some big discovery is because he already set up the false dichotomy that the only way for these numbers to have been put there without reference to an actual history is for there to have been a millennia-long multi-generational conspiracy. In fact, all that's needed is some dude with some basic mathematical skill.
It slopes down in a way that's statistically predictable, where 95% of the data points are falling along a predictable pattern called the power law curve.
Okay, so far in responding to this, I've been taking it in good faith that Dan is just presenting the numbers in the Genesis genealogy as he finds them in the Masoretic text. In fact, he presented that as a data table, and it's the data table I used to get my second-order polynomial curve of best fit with its r-squared value of 0.8787. So what's this graph then? Well, it turns out it's figure 3 from Genetic Entropy Recorded in the Bible by John Sanford and Christopher Root, published near as I can tell, just on the internet as a PDF. The data table for this has some interesting aspects. For one thing, notice that there's only one age in the graph for one generation after Noah. Turns out that's Shem. Where did Japheth and Ham go? Well, they aren't in the data, because obviously if you have 3 data points with different y values all on the exact same x value, it's going to decrease the fit value and increase your p-value. Further, you might know that there's a big gap after the middle part of the graph until the next data point. That's King David. What about all the other kings with known ages? Even the ones who died of natural causes as opposed to the ones who died violently. I mean, it seems fair to exclude the murdered people, since clearly their ages at death don't reflect lifespan. But, what about the others? Oh, you see they go up and down, and so, again, decrease the closeness of the fit and increase the p-value. Then, of course, we skip down to average Roman life expectancy, which helps finish off the tail of this with a nice low value of 45. What's the problem with that? Well, life expectancy isn't the same thing as lifespan. The thing is that the lifespan is how old a member of a population will live on average, assuming that they do not die of something that can't be attributed to old age, like a sudden plague, murder, etc. The lifespan of Romans and the age of King David would be pretty much the same, again lowering the closeness of the fit and increasing the p-value. So when Dan says you can't make this up, what he really means is that anyone can make this up if they just pick numbers that work on either tail of the graph and exclude numbers that don't work so well. This is intentional p-hacking. This is manipulation of the sample in order to get a desired level of statistical significance. Sanford and Root are lying in this paper. There's no way around it. Sanford at least knows enough about statistics, being a former scientist, to know better. I want to thank Marshall Jansen of the BioLogos forums, whose post led me to the source of this graph and pointed me towards the data table for figure 3. I don't even know who you are, Marshall, but I greatly appreciate you making my life just that much easier.
So they're predicting, and you guys, the Bible scribes from thousands of years ago, they didn't know advanced math.
Why not? This was done in Babylon. Babylonians did square roots, squaring, division, fractional notation. A well-educated Babylonian was probably better at math than the average US high school graduate, and the average high school graduate can square a number, multiply numbers, and divide numbers. That's all it would take to create this correlation. But let's remember, the correlation isn't real in the first place. It only appears if you cherry-pick the data to get the best fit with the lowest p-value possible, without looking too much like that's what you're doing.
They didn't know how to square things and cube things.
Like I just said, there is absolutely no reason to think that's true. Babylonians were quite good at math, and the authors, or at least the redactor of Genesis, lived in Babylonia. They figured out the value of the square root of 2 to several decimal points. Why does Dan have so little faith in the abilities of the authors of the Bible who got the Bible to us? Personally, I hate it when edgelord atheists call the Hebrew Scriptures books written by Bronze Age goat herders, when in fact they were written by highly educated Iron Age scribes. I guess Dan agrees with those edgy atheists.
And develop, probability values and ANOVAs and R-squares.
I'll grant that they probably didn't do that. They probably didn't know about p-values and r-values and such, but who cares? The correlation is made up anyway. Sanford and Root had to cherry-pick data to get their p-hack statistics anyway.
And you just can't have someone invent this stuff where these dots, their lifespans, fall along such a predictable slope. Something else is going on.
Yeah, that something is called intentional p-hacking. It's generally considered from bad form to outright academic fraud.
And it's happening so strong that its likelihood is not, when I would testify as an expert about statistics in court, I just had to beat the 5% level of chance. Well, then you've got 1% or 0.1, 0.5%. But this is statistically significant, off the chart. It goes all the way into the quadrillions. The curve fit of this line shows that there's a phenomenon going on with our lifespans that is not a chance occurrence. Something is happening.
Well, yeah, it wasn't by chance. It was specifically and nakedly fraudulent, albeit not in the criminal sense. Sanford and Roop decided that genetic entropy, their made-up incoherent bullshit, was the cause of the decline in lifespans, and that a good statistical fit would make that seem more plausible. So they cherry-picked ages from the Bible and then used the wrong age from historical research for Romans, all in an effort to get evidence to support their pet idea, if it even counts as an idea. This is the exact opposite of doing science. This is the kind of thing I mean when I say the creationists and real scientists don't have the same data, because creationists intentionally leave out relevant data. Even data as important as the fact that Noah is supposed to have had 3 sons and not just one can get flushed down the drain if it doesn't fit with the conclusions creationists must reach, no matter what the data are.
And these old guys writing with feather pens and little monk hats couldn't have done it. They couldn't have done the advanced math to pull that off. So,
what is Dan even talking about? The people making copies of the Bible didn't have to be in on anything. Even if we pretend that his amazing statistics weren't just cooked up by Sanford and Roop, which they demonstrably were, the scribes are just copying down what the previous copy said. All they would need to do is just not screw up too badly. They didn't need to be investigating the numbers. I feel like Dan doesn't even have a coherent model of reality in his head. So much of what he says is just bafflingly nonsensical. How does this man even function day to day? Based on what he says, it seems like he's the kind of guy who would pour coffee into his ear, then use his toothbrush to wash his eyeballs before tossing some neckties on his feet and attempting to drive his garage to work.
We can take this data, for example.
These data.
We can plot it all out, and using the data itself, we can predict lifespan intervals. So we can take the curve itself mathematically and predict, well, this guy should have lived 275 years, this guy should have lived 130 years, and all the data fits perfectly within it.
Wow, the data Sanford and Roop used to generate this curve fits within the margin of error of that curve? How shocking that this mathematically inevitable fact is in fact a fact.
So you can't have these Bible scribes knowing polynomial math or exponential math.
Remind me in the comments, how much math would a scribe who's just transmitting a text need to know in order for 2 liars in the 21st century to cherry-pick numbers from the books they copied and then find a curve that they themselves designed? I feel like it's none. But also, if we're talking about scribes down the ages, then exponential math has been well understood for like 4,500 years or more. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't know that, even if their knowledge of it is utterly irrelevant. As for polynomials, yeah, near as I can tell, they came out in like the 17th century or so. So I guess they wouldn't have known that. And remember that right above the comments and below this video is a join button. That will let you become a member of the channel starting at only $1.99 US a month. You get early access to videos, channel emojis, and a membership chat each month.
And logarithms and things like that.
Sure, logarithms were also a product of the 17th century mathematics, but again, who cares? Even if the curve of the lifespans were as exact as he's pretending, the fact is that logarithms can be applied to numbers that were invented before logarithms were known to exist. A logarithm is basically asking what number do you need to raise a number to in order to get another number. So the log base 10 of 1,000 is 3, because 10 to the third power is 1,000. The log base 10 of 3,000 is about 3.4771212547196625. Because when you raise 10 by that exponent, you get 3,000, then a decimal place, then like 11 zeros, then a 1 and a bunch more numbers or so, which is really close to 3,000. But do you need to know that in order to multiply 10 by itself a bunch of times, or to use the number 3,000, or the number 3.48, or anything like that? No, of course not. Nothing in the Bible indicates that the author would have had to use any advanced math to come up with the ages if they weren't real. They don't even fit the curve Dan thinks they fit nearly as well as he thinks. I mean, hell, the math Dan is relying on doesn't even notice that Noah had more than one son.
So something's going on with the data itself that couldn't have been invented by Bible scribes.
But it could have been invented by a couple scammers trying to support the stupidest idea in the history of population genetics.
In fact, just think about it from a practical level. If you were trying to pitch this myth idea of your religion called the Bible or Judaism or Christianity or whatever it was, why on earth would you write about people living for hundreds and hundreds of years? Because it would go against the credibility of your case.
not in a cultural context where such ages are common in things like genealogies and king lists. That would be entirely ordinary and expected. The problem Dan is having is that he doesn't realize that the context of the ancient Near East and the context of modern-day 21st century California are not at all the same context.
But they're writing these long lifespans even despite of that. So,
no, they're writing them specifically because that is what would be expected. Dan just refuses to put the biblical texts into the context of the culture that produced them and to which their target audiences belonged. He cannot escape from the mindset of a 21st century American statistician. It's beyond him. And what's the context in which Genesis came into more or less its present form? The Babylonian exile, something Christians generally are aware of.
Here we go. They would have to carry on that lie over about 3,000 years of biblical history. You'd have to have all these authors in it, handing the baton one guy to the next, saying, hey, when you record the lifespans of Shem and Arphaxad and Selah, just take it down a notch, 50 years, 30 years, something like that. Don't take it from 900 years to 80 years. You got to slide it down the scale over time.
Except, none of those people wrote the books in question. Most of them didn't even exist, and pretending that they did in order to make this argument work is, of course, assuming the historicity of Genesis in order to argue for the historicity of Genesis. Once again, Dan is begging the question. But also, I love that evangelicals are usually among Christians the most adamant about rejecting things like the documentary hypothesis of the authorship of the Pentateuch in favor of Mosaic authorship. But here comes Dan saying, nah, it's not one author. It's like 10 or 11 authors, guys. Dan's idea of the authorship of the Bible is fringe even among the most conservative Protestant extremists. This is just completely off the rails. Also note that these alleged authors aren't the scribes and monk hats that he described later. Monasticism in Christianity wasn't even a thing until the 4th century when St. Anthony of Egypt went to live in a cave in the desert to separate himself from what he saw as a wicked and sinful culture, only to gather a following. Monks in Christianity are an entirely post-biblical phenomenon.
There's no way that happened. This is real data, and the Bible proves that out.
You know what? I'll grant that the data is real. It's just that cherry-picked data, while real, don't really tell us much except what the people who did the cherry-picking want to be true, and that those same people don't care about whether it's actually true.
And interestingly enough, you take Luke chapter 3, we have these 77 patriarchs going from Christ all the way back to Adam, and many of the lifespans of these people were in that data plot that I just showed you.
Actually, almost none of them were included in the data table. In fact, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Abinadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amon, Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Abiud, Eliakim, Azor, Sadok, Achim, Eliud, Eleazar, Matan, Jacob, Joseph, Nathan, Mattatha, Mena, Meliah, Jonam, the other Joseph, Judah, Simeon, Adi, Qasim, Elmadam, Eleazar, Jorim, Mathat, Levi, Melchi, Neri, Johanan, Joda, Joseph, Simeon, Janai, Matthias, Amos, Nahum, Helsi, Nagai, Math, and Melchi are all on the genealogy graph that Dan is using, but were not in the data table used to generate the figure of best fit curve. Funny how that works, isn't it?
So we go from Christ all the way through King David and Abraham and Noah. These are the 77 patriarchs that go from Jesus back to Adam in just one chapter of the Bible, Luke chapter 3. And this data mats perfectly upon that predicted decay curve that we just went through.
Sounds cool, but is it true? Can we see the data? Why weren't most of them in the initial data set? It couldn't be because the more relevant data you put in there, the less the curve fits, could it? Yeah, that's exactly why.
So I think for me, it really validates the whole of Scripture when you put it all together.
Yeah, well, that's why the data was cherry-picked that way in the first place. So I guess mission accomplished to Sanford and Rube. Too bad about none of it actually working without the cherry-picking, though, isn't it? That's the end of his presentation. But now it's question time. So here's Kent with the first question.
Well, I've got one right away, brother. How do I get that messianic genealogy chart you just showed?
Just Google Jesus genealogy and go to the image results.
I've been a Christian 55 years. I've never heard that. Jesus was the 77th generation.
How has Kent never heard this? First, you can just count. Second, the number isn't an accident. It was put there because the number 7 had special significance to the audience of probably early 2nd century Christians who were familiar with the use of the number in previous Hebrew numerology. The fact that the number of listed generations from Adam to Jesus is a numerologically significant number isn't evidence of historicity. It can be very well explained as the contrivance of the author of the Gospel of Luke, who probably wasn't a guy named Luke. Dan's response is just complaining about old Earth creationist takes on this. That's boring, and I don't really care about two groups of obviously incorrect people arguing about which version of pseudo-history they want to accept. I'm going to cut to the next question.
Well, atheists will say there's a contradiction between Luke and Matthew's genealogy because it switches at King David, which is his different son.
They manifestly do contradict. Just as an obvious example, who was Joseph's father? In Matthew, it's Jacob, and in Luke, it's Heli. So unless Joseph's family was way more progressive than I expect, and Jacob and Heli were a gay couple who adopted Joseph, there's an obvious contradiction.
With Luke, it's Nathan, and with David, it's Solomon.
Yep, that's another contradiction. Which son of David is Jesus' direct patrilineal ancestor changes between the books, as do most of the other names, really.
I mean, with
There you
Matthew,
go.
it's Solomon. It's not a
Yeah,
contradiction.
there's great explanations for all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there is a great explanation for it. The genealogies were written for rhetorical reasons and are not reflective of the actual ancestry of Jesus, not the least because it's almost certain that absolutely no reliable records survived from the time of David into the time of Jesus, but also because we have no reason to think that anyone before David was even a real person, and in some cases we know for certain that they weren't. Any attempt to harmonize these will have to flatly ignore what the text says in at least one of the Gospels. That's because the Gospels don't agree, and forcing them to will require doing metaphorical violence to at least one of the Gospels. Also, we don't actually get any reason why this isn't a contradiction. We just move on to the next question. That's convenient.
Did the flood create the tectonic plates? Kind of seems that way from the theory.
That's actually an interesting question. We have evidence of plate movements well before the Cambrian, but catastrophic plate tectonics doesn't seem to account for this. I wonder what Dan will say.
So I would say yes. I would say I would say that the flood created the Mid-Atlantic ridge and the oceanic rift system of about 40,000 miles.
Then how does Dan account for supercontinents before Pangaea, like Valbara and Rodinia? Those existed and broke up long before the Mid-Atlantic ridge formed.
As far as the tectonic plates itself, I would have to punt to either Steve Austin about that question or Dr. John Baumgartner. I could find that out for you.
Honestly, that's a fair response. He doesn't know the answer within the paradigm he's working in, so he'd rather have someone who he thinks does know give the answer. That's probably the first respectable thing I've seen Dan Biddle do. Now, granted, neither Austin nor Baumgartner have a leg to stand on, and at least Austin is also a known fraud, and Baumgartner is someone who seems to think that simulations that are intentionally set with unrealistic parameters are evidence of the real history of the Earth, so he's either a knowing fraud or an idiot of the highest order. So I'm not sure either of these would really help, but Dan probably doesn't think that that's true of either of them, so I wouldn't expect him to treat them with the respect they deserve, which is more or less none.
But if you look at the way that the plates moved during the flood, there could be a good argument for saying that I think the tectonic plates probably were either created during the flood or shaped during the flood or somehow refined during the flood.
I guess, yeah, if the flood were real and we ignore the heat problems, then sure, the flood would almost certainly have had a profound effect on the tectonic plates of the Earth.
I agree. I think when the fountains of the deep broke open, the Earth cracked up like an eggshell.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Pieces are still floating around. Good. Thank you, Clara, for that question. Any more?
So I guess Kent is just inconsistent on whether or not Pangaea was real. I'm not terribly surprised. He probably doesn't even notice. And of course, our next question is from everyone's favorite author of books that contain truncated and underlined hyperlinks as references, Donnie Budinsky. This is the first time I've bothered to cover anything by him since he made it clear that he's an abusive piece of shit who shouldn't be pissed on if he were on fire, and who also doesn't have an original idea in his brain, and who wouldn't know a massive contradiction if it just slapped him across the face.
I would just like to look at the ordering of the fossil record to argue for common descent. What's the best creationist response to this? Okay, what about the order of the fossil record?
Of course, it's more than just that scientists look at the available fossils and then conclude that evolution explains them. That is true. They do that, but they do much more. They can use evolutionary theory to predict both what kinds of morphology to expect in as of yet undiscovered transitional fossils, but also where they should find them, and they actually get it right. Creationists can, of course, accommodate the fossil record with ever more implausible post hoc rationalizations, but they can't make predictions about it. Evolution can, and does, and gets them right. That's something Donnie in particular likes to call the gold standard in science.
Kent, you've done a lot on this. In fact, I recall you saying before that you really can't find anywhere on Earth where you have a nice, clean, orderly fossil record from the Permian all the way up to the top of the Cretaceous.
Which is irrelevant. Let's say that I collect 6,000 copies of the King James Bible, and from each of them I removed 80% of the chapters randomly, and all chapter and verse numbers. And there is a 1 in 3 chance that for some of them I take what remains and flip some of it around so it's upside down or backwards or something like that. Then I rebind the books. Then I distribute those books, each unique, to 6,000 people and ask them to reconstruct the King James Bible text as it originally existed, minus the chapter and verse numbers. And none of them are allowed to reference any complete copies of the King James. And I'll stipulate that none of them are familiar with it. Could they do it? It seems obvious that yes, they could. They could easily see that, except in cases where the text is clearly upside down or backwards, that there is an obvious ordering. The text of Genesis 1 always comes before Genesis 2, and Genesis 2 before 3, and so on. But even when some of the chapters are missing between the parts of the text, they're still not out of order unless the text itself has been flipped, which itself is reasonably obvious and easy to correct. Provided that the group has all the chapters between the 6,000 of them, they will successfully reconstruct the text. That's how the stratigraphic column is. In no one place do we tend to have an unbroken depositional environment since the Cambrian, but we do have deposition preserved in the rocks all over the world and always in the same order. When the order is violated, we see things like evidence of uplift, folding, etc., which when corrected for gives us the order back. Just like none of the Bibles were complete, no single locale is likely to be complete in terms of stratigraphy, yet this is no barrier to constructing a model of either the KJV or the rock record of Earth.
I can say that the orders or the we can't say sequence, but the grouping of fossils do have a very clean grouping that corresponds with the flood. For example,
weird. Kent has typically held the opposite.
No, very quickly, I think the sudden appearance, first of all, you're still assuming that the fossil record exists and means something. I would disagree with that.
You have the Jurassic layers that are in fact below what we would call the Cretaceous layers, and you do have distinct but similar animals in the Jurassic layers that are different in many respects to the animals that are in the Cretaceous layers.
None of which is predicted by creationism, hence why at least in the past Kent has denied that this very obvious fact about the fossil record is even true. Creationism just attempts to accommodate these data, but it generally fails. Let's see what failed excuse Dan has for us.
But that's just because you have different zones and regions and habitats and ecological systems that are being buried in different sequences during the flood.
Ah yes, ecological zonation. The way that we know that Pisanosaurus, a Triassic reptile, lived right on the coast, while Tylosaurus, a Cretaceous reptile, must have lived in one of those high-elevation oceans I hear so much about. That makes perfect sense. Oh wait, no it doesn't. It is completely contradicted by just a very basic observation that in situ marine fossils are found throughout the whole column.
So one of our videos talks about the Sauk megasequence.
That's the Sauk Crotonic sequence. It's a record of one of the earliest sea transgressions in North America. It does not correlate to depositions outside North America, and it is not a record of a single flood. Instead, it's composed of numerous strata with diverse marine depositional environments. Most of them are low-energy deposits, precluding this from being a flood deposit. The term megasequence is, near as I can tell, a creationist original. When you search for it, you generally just get creationist sources or debunking sources about creationism.
Which is the first one to go. There's evolutionists even agree to what's called the Sloss megasequences, the SLOSS. Dr. Tim Clary has done a lot with this, but
that's just yet another crotonic sequence recording another sea transgression with the same diversity of environment and the same evidence of absolutely precluding a catastrophic origin for the sequence as a whole.
With ICR, the first three to happen were the Sauk Tippecanoe and Kaskaskia.
Ah, good. The crotonic sequence gang is all here.
They were all marine sequences.
Yes, when sea levels rise, allowing the interior of continents to be part of the ocean, you tend to get marine sequences. But marine and flood environments aren't the same thing.
And over 80 to 90% of the fossils in those three sequences are all marine creatures.
Yeah, because that's who lives in the ocean, and when there's a sea transgression, the ocean is where there'd otherwise be land. None of this is helping Dan's case. All of it is just the same thing that when scientists look at, they see the inescapable evidence of deep time.
We don't get the land creatures being buried until the Zuni Sloss megasequence, which is the fourth, which happened at the zenith of the flood.
But from then on, and even before, the idea of going up in elevation doesn't help. And further, the higher crotonic sequences are also marine, because you can't be a record of a sea transgression without being marine. So this doesn't really help. It doesn't do anything to indicate that you're going uphill. Instead, the only real explanation is that in the earlier sea transgressions, there just were no significant land animals to be washed into the sea.
So if you look at our, let me see, if you go to our YouTube channel and look at our most watched flood video, we
Pass.
Get into the Sloss mega sequences, but they're all there's not an order, and it's not a sequence. It's a sequence of burial, but not a sequence of evolution.
Cool story. Now, if only there were any actual evidence to back that up, instead of literal mountains of evidence that flatly contradict it. And do note that all this ecological zonation would have to be under a flood that's actually steam, if not plasma, so you know, it couldn't leave behind any kind of marine deposition. Dan doesn't have a solution to the heat problem, and so far he hasn't even bothered to note that his own model would vaporize the oceans many times over. Oops.
I tell people on our tour, clams are usually found at the bottom because they're already at the bottom when the flood starts.
Except that they're not just found at the bottom. Clams are found throughout the highest layers, including the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. That fact on its own should give anyone pause to consider how clams managed to get up so high. Did they run to the mountaintops? That hardly seems likely.
Of course, they're the first ones buried.
Except that the problem is that they're not found in the lowest layers. They don't show up until the Devonian. Where are all the Cambrian bivalves? Oh, but what's this? It's Halkieria, an early Cambrian mollusk that sure looks like a missing link that's going from the most basal mollusk on to becoming a real clam in a few tens of millions of years. Weird how even with Ken's favorite example, evolution and common descent work way better than ecological zonation, isn't it? But also, that's it. After that, Ken just thanks Dan for coming by, and Dan gives his contact info again. Well, I, for one, am glad that's over. I guess it was interesting that at no point did Kent give any pushback on Dan, even in the cases where I know he believes differently than Dan. Donnie does that too. He'll agree with basically anything a friendly guest says, even if the day before another guest said exactly the opposite. Maybe being an invertebrate is just a job requirement for being a pro or semi-pro creationist. Oh well. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Hovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Ella Runteller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostock Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Wallace, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.